at a time?
Yeah,
Okay, then moving second that we have a majority for sponsorship. That means that the House can't ride over the Senate and the Senate can't try to do the same. Everybody understand it?
and Mr. Chairman, let me say by word of explanation, the trouble you get into is if you don't have that, and if there are differences, systematic differences between the two houses, and I think there probably are, you can get a bill that become a committee bill that can't get a hearing in the second house. And we had one of those last time, and I think it forces us to reach the compromises at the committee level, and I think that's a good idea.
I concur. So I'm going to say that it's on page 86 of the rules that were in front of our handbook. It is on sample rule 2D as adopted by the Senate. Does that clear it up a little bit, Ryan? Okay. Go ahead, Representative.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. It's Brown. You've only known me for 8 years, but it's okay. It's okay. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to be voting no, and the reason being, I understand what the good chairman is saying and the reasoning behind this, but I have a serious concern that when you have 14 legislators sitting up on a dais, that 3 members can disrupt the entire process of a piece of legislation as it moves through. So while I understand the intent and the practicality of getting both houses to do this, it is against what we have done traditionally as a body in the legislature. It's been here and there as it's gone through, but I will be voting no because I don't see the value in really bringing House education bills just to bring forward, just to have the discussion, just to die over in the Senate. Let's bring it as a merit and let it live or die on its merit. Thank you.
Any other discussion? Go ahead, Senator Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be voting yes on the rules, and not just because I'm in the Senate, but because, and that is our rule, but because I've served on committees that have done it both ways. I really feel for the benefit of our tax-paying public that it's important that we work on bills and come to a consensus in the committee process. We all know this is a budget session. It will require 2/3 introduction as well. And so it's a very high bar. So a committee bill should be set at a high bar as well coming out of committee. And so I support this rule.
Any other discussion? Anybody else? Go ahead, Representative Brown.
For LSO, if we adopt these rules going into this session, can they be re-amended and re-adopted going forward? Or are we adopting today as they go forward? Because our next interim work, as I understand it, this would require the same vote as we move into a general session post this budget session.
Go ahead, Tanya.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, generally speaking, once you adopt these rules, it controls for the 67th. There's nothing that would dissuade you if the majority of the committee felt later that they wanted to deviate from that. I think that's appropriate, but generally speaking, the practice has been it covers the next 2 sessions.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead, Senator.
Just brief addendum to that point, though, that any further motion to amend the rules would require, if that motion were to pass, would require a majority of both voting separately. If that motion were to pass, as a minimum, might even require more than that to amend the rules. Not in the first instance. At this point, it's a majority of all.
Majority of all. Mr. Chairman, I think it would be a majority of all to change the rules because this rule, we're only applying it to the sponsorship of bills.
Okay, thank you. Correct.
Okay, anybody else got any more discussion? If not, we'll proceed to vote. All those in favor of the proposed rule, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed to the rules, say aye.
No.
Aye.
No.
No.
Well, it doesn't matter.
No.
All right, we're gonna do a show of hands. All those in favor, please raise your hands. 5. All those opposed, raise your hand. Okay, so that bill has failed.
Mr. Chairman, the consequence
sorry,
of that is that if we get a bill that does not have a majority of senators in favor of it, it's not going to get heard in the Senate. And we had one of those last time, and I could not get it out of committee. The budget session, we're just not going to waste the time.
Got it. You had other things
Yeah.
you wanted to talk about?
Okay, absentee voting, and I'm not clear whether this is the current default or whether we need a motion on it. The practice in this committee has been, if somebody is here and has heard a majority of the testimony on it and then has to leave, they can leave a vote. And what we want to do is authorize acceptance of vote under those circumstances. It would preclude somebody who had not been here at all from leaving a vote on a bill they hadn't heard about.
And Mr. Chairman, I believe that that's just a clarification that that's what we're going to have for practice.
Yeah,
Okay.
do we need a motion on the rules on that, Tanya?
Mr. Chairman, you do not need a motion, but it's appropriate to clarify that you will be accepting absentee or proxy voting, as generally what it's referred to, in the event that the member has participated or observed a majority of the discussion. That's what I understand you're directing staff.
That's what we're saying. That's exactly right.
Okay. The third item is issue of taking remote testimony. We will do that, and I think that's the way the draft rules are structured. We will take the remote testimony if we're meeting at a facility that is capable of handling it. And that's an important precaution because I think Chairman Northrup and I both think that we need to actually have some meetings at community colleges to become more familiar with them, and some of those facilities may not. And the other circumstances could arise where we were at a place where we can't get remote testimony. Under those circumstances, we wouldn't, but otherwise we will from the general public.
And I would
And-
just,
Go ahead.
I'd just like to add that if it gets to the point that we have 15 or 20 people that want to remote testify, we may go put a time limit on it and cut that down, or even limit the number of people just in the presence of the limited amount of time that we have
And
in a full schedule.
I would say if we get a schedule that's going to be tight and we have an issue where we think we're going to get a lot of testimony, we may require remote testimony people to sign up ahead of time so that we know how many we're dealing with and can set a time limit. And we might have to do that just in order to get our work done, so. But none of that requires a motion on the rules, right, Tanya? LSO?
Nothing requires, yeah, it's just all, we're just clarifying our position at this time. Okay,
Yep. Mr. Chairman, there was a change to management council policy at the last management council meeting regarding remote testimony, and so that's why it's noted. So if the meeting is held at what is defined as an approved meeting location, remote testimony will be taken. This room is a good example. It's an approved meeting location.
very good. Okay, we'll move on. We're up to item number 2 on the agenda, which is an update on the school finance litigation. Mr. Clausen. The floor is yours.
Good
Welcome.
morning, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Scott, Chairman Northrup, members of the committee.
A little closer to the mic, please.
I apologize for that. I'm tall, so I've got to get the mic up here. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Clausen. I'm a Deputy Attorney General for the Wyoming Office of the Attorney General, and I am head of the School Finance Litigation Unit for the office, as well as the Tort Litigation Unit. At the request of the committee, I'm here to provide an overview and update regarding the ongoing school finance litigation, the case entitled the Wyoming Education Association versus State of Wyoming. I'm going to keep my comments today at a very high level, given just the sensitivities of litigation. Most of this is going to be, or should all entirely be publicly available information. but I'm here to answer whatever questions you might have about it at the close of my comments. The lawsuit that we're discussing was initiated on August 18th of 2022. The WEA sued the state of Wyoming, challenging the constitutionality of the state financing system, school financing system. The case has been in a bit of a holding pattern. I'm sure that's probably some of the curiosity here as why it hasn't advanced. Part of that was due to some preliminary motion that we filed, a motion to dismiss, challenging the standing of WEA to bring such a lawsuit. That motion was denied in part and granted in part. The court determined that WEA does have standing to bring the case, but it did dismiss claims for attorney's fees and punitive damages that had been alleged in the case. It was also expected, I think, by WEA from the start that there were a number of school districts who would intervene in the case. Those districts stayed out of the case for some time, including during the last legislative session. It was only after that session then that we received their motion to intervene in the case. That motion was not opposed, and they have now become parties to the litigation. There are 8 districts that have joined, including Albany, Campbell, Carbon 1, Laramie 1, Lincoln 1, Sweetwater 1 and 2, and Uinta counties are currently the named plaintiff districts, intervening plaintiffs in the case. I want to give the committee, I assume many of you may have reviewed some of the pleadings in the case, but and I think most folks in this room also know that the state has a bit of a long history of legal battles over education funding. Wyoming, like many other states, has included clauses in its constitution at the time of statehood about the obligation of the state to provide instruction in a system of public schools. Eventually, those clauses were used as a basis for parties to begin to challenge the way that states were funding education, both the fairness of that funding, meaning was it being equitably distributed, as well as later the adequacy of that funding, meaning are we providing enough? Here in Wyoming, those fights began back with the Washakie case way back in 1980. And then that was followed by the series of cases probably more familiar to many, the Campbell cases. There was a series of 4 decisions that were issued by the Supreme Court starting in the 1990s, and the last decision was finally issued, and Campbell 4 came out in 2008. That last decision in Campbell essentially said that our school financing system, as it had been through many different iterations and adjustments, that as it was in place was a constitutional system, that it provided enough funding and that it was a matter of, it was fair to all of the districts. The challenging districts in WA now claim that that's no longer the case. As before, the case involves both challenges to operational funding as well as funding for facilities. And so I'll give the committee just kind of a very high-level overview of what's at issue here. When it comes to the operations funding, the allegations that were raised by WEA as well as the intervening districts, their complaint and intervention, I would say there's a lot of overlap between the two. There's not a lot of distance between them. The WEA complaint was a little more wide-ranging. The district's complaint's a little more direct, but they cover essentially the same issues. And as to operations, the main issues are primarily the external cost adjustment, as well as a challenge to salary levels being paid. I think this committee is familiar with the ECA. It's the inflationary adjustment that is made between periods of recalibration for the funding model. The challengers are claiming that there has been a lack of ECAs or that ECAs have not been sustained. And as you know, the external cost adjustments cover 4 different areas. They cover both professional and non-professional salaries, as well as supplies, and then you have energy or utility costs. Those are the 4 categories to which the ECA applies. Again, the second major category, and I say major because this has implications in terms of the potential financial ramifications for the state, is a challenge to the overall salary levels across districts. The challenge, of course, is that the claim is that the average model salaries are lower than what the districts are actually paying, and that the claim being made is that Wyoming is losing its competitive advantage compared to other states and peers around the country in terms of the pay, in particular for teachers. There are other aspects of operational funding that are challenged in the course of this lawsuit, including seeking more funding for other model components, including things like tutors, social workers, counselors, nurses, and other support staff. And then the lawsuit also seeks funding for areas that are not currently within the model. There's a request for funding for school lunch program expenses, and then also a challenge to whether the state should be funding security personnel for schools, particularly school resource officers around the state. So those are primarily the claims that are made on the operational side. Turning to the capital construction or school facilities side of the lawsuit, the claim there, and again, this is at a high level summary, the allegations are that the state is not properly assessing facilities. The allegation is that the state is manipulating and changing its evaluation methods to avoid having to fund new facilities. There's also a claim about the elimination of suitability as a factor in determining the adequacy of facilities. And I think that's probably, again, familiar to many members of this committee. The legislative body has kind of gone through various iterations of whether suitability as a concept will be measured or assessed in terms of the buildings. When we talk about suitability, that really can be broken down. There's various definitions of it. That's part of the issue, is whether you can really objectively define what suitability is for an educational space. But in some manners, it's been defined to include things like tech readiness, adequate lighting, ventilation, air quality, those kinds of issues that can affect a space beyond just its overall condition. There's also a challenge in the lawsuit demanding that the state identify a dedicated revenue stream for facilities, meaning you can't just find somewhere in the budget, but you need to find a dedicated stream of revenue for that purpose. And then claims about the physical security of those buildings. Claims being that there are certain facilities in the state that, by virtue of their layout and design, cannot be made adequately secure. So those are the, sort of at a high level, the allegations in the case. I want to give you an idea of sort of the timing and the trajectory of the case. We just recently, earlier this month, had a scheduling conference with the court and established a number of deadlines in the case, including a trial date. This case is set for trial for 5 weeks in June of 2024. I know for some folks that may seem like a long time out. That's not unusual in litigation. It allows a period of time for discovery, for motion practice. So it's, in fact, that may be a pretty narrow time frame given the scope of the issues that we have in this case. We did request some additional time. The court gave us until June of 2024. We'll be engaged over the next few months in written discovery, as well as depositions and preparation of expert witnesses in the case. It's possible that some issues in the case may resolve at summary judgment, meaning they'll be decided as a matter of law, where there are no issues of fact that are in dispute. But I think there are a number of issues in this case that are going to be factual issues that can't be resolved at that stage, and will probably, at least several of them will end up at a trial. The case is pending before Judge Froelicher in the 1st Judicial District in Cheyenne. In terms of the progress of the case, we are providing regular updates to LSO staff engaged with them in this case. And so if there are any questions or concerns that any of you may have, they would be your point of contact. Again, you're welcome to contact us directly as well, but for purposes of just the sake of efficiency, we're using LSO as kind of a repository for information for members. With that, I I would stand for any questions from the committee. If there are any, would be happy to take those at this time.
Chairman Scott, go ahead.
On the issue, the dedicated revenue stream, is that issue confined to the school capital construction, or is that a more general issue?
As it's framed in the pleadings in the case, it's confined to the school facilities side of the equation.
Do you have further questions, Chairman Scott?
No.
Go ahead, Senator Bateman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Follow up to Senator Scott's question. Are they seeking a constitutional change with this dedicated source of funding? Because it's not in the Constitution that there has to be. So are they trying to use the court system to circumvent the legislative process to get that into the Constitution without the legislature involvement?
Go ahead, Mark.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Beitman, I don't want, I guess in this setting, to characterize what I think they may be doing. I think there are a number of defenses that we'll be raising to that particular allegation, not the least of which I think is the sense we have that this body has its discretion to exercise in terms of determining where the money is going to come from for those facilities. So the challenge is to, I guess, as we understand it, is not necessarily that they're trying to change the Constitution or end run around. I think they would characterize it as trying to ensure that there's compliance with the Constitution as it's been interpreted through the Campbell decisions.
Representative Lawley has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Deputy Clausen, thank you for being here and giving a great overview, very helpful. My question is kind of similar to Senator Beitman's, is related to going back to the last Campbell case. You made a wonderful point about the school financing system was declared constitutional, a constitutional system. It met the requirements of the Wyoming Constitution. I think that's a very important point. But my question is, most of what you described in the pleadings of plaintiffs seem to be not really attacking the system itself, but perhaps how they, not necessarily what issues they might have with how it functions. Do you see a distinction there between the constitutionality of the system itself versus some different viewpoints on how well it might be functioning or working? And is that material?
Go ahead, Mr. Clausen.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Lawley, appreciate the question. If you look at the complaint filed by the districts, they frame it as not a challenge to the constitutionality of the system itself, but instead a challenge to the lack of compliance with that system is how they frame it. Yep. So I think you've identified a key point, and that is I don't think that any of the parties are interested in relitigating the funding model itself. It's more how that model is being followed or not followed, how that constitutional system, the compliance with that system. Does that answer your question, ma'am?
Yes, but a follow-up.
Go ahead, follow up.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So again, it kind of gets to, I think, Senator Beitman's point about, at what point, and again, maybe we can't talk about that here, but that there might be legitimate compliance issues, and then there might be a bucket over here of pushing harder to sort of take over the role of the legislature as appropriators and decision makers and policy makers. So I guess that's my question of, is that going to be sorted out, you see, in this process of a distinction between, there might be some questions about whether we've, complied, like on the ECA, for example. We did what we agreed to do in effect, and then there are others that may be a little different issue.
Good, Mark.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Lawley, I think there always has been this tension between the discretion and the prerogatives of the legislative body and the requirements of the Constitution. And the courts have endeavored, I think, over the years in different ways and different fashions to figure out what that balance is. I'd like to talk to you at more depth about some of those issues. I'm reluctant to do so in a public setting here, but there's certainly a lot of things that we will be putting forward in defense of those legislative prerogatives.
Okay, further questions? Anybody? All right. Thank you, Mark. We appreciate it.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
Okay, we're up to item number 4, which is or 3, which is an update from the State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Megan Degenfelder. You have a handout, great. Welcome, how are you doing? Good.
It's great to be here overlooking my alma mater and the soccer field I spent too many hours on. So good reminder of the great public education I received and many of us in this room. So
There you go.
it's great to be here.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, committee members. Thank you for the opportunity to address you all today. The partnership between the legislative branch and the executive branch is critical, especially as we discuss these difficult education issues, and I'm committed to working with all of you throughout my term. I would like to take this time to update you on my strategic plan, which was released this past Thursday and includes many of the topics that you'll be discussing today and tomorrow. The plan is based on thousands of conversations that I had during the year campaigning with education stakeholders, including teachers, parents, business, industry, and each of the education associations. The plan is divided into 6 key initiative areas, each with identified and actionable goals. In order to most effectively move these goals forward and to ensure the voices of Wyoming people are heard, the 6 initiatives all have appointed cabinets of stakeholders. There are over 75 total cabinet members, and they are the individuals on the ground doing the work around education. They are teachers working in the classroom, school and district leaders, parents, school board members, and members of the business community. The cabinets are all around 10 to 15 members each, so that they are small and nimble enough to get the work done, but large enough to be representative. The strategic plan is a plan of action, and it will not just sit on a shelf. We will deliver on these goals, and we will challenge the status quo, and we'll work together to deliver an even better education to Wyoming students. As you will notice, many of these goals will require great partnership. They cannot be done alone through the Department of Education. They require partnership with the legislature, with the State Board of Education, school districts, and Wyoming industry in order to reach optimal success. With that, I'll quickly run through the plan with you. The first initiative area is parental empowerment and eliminating political bias. Goals focus around increasing transparency, specifically through the state agency rather than on the backs of teachers, on establishing model policy for districts to ensure parental rights around health records and appropriate library books, creating common definitions and a commitment through a partnership with our school districts to ensure that political agendas are nowhere near the classroom, and creating more choice in education to best meet the individual learning needs of our students, from school choice in our traditional system to our public charter schools. The second initiative area is preparing students for jobs through career and technical education. And this initiative can really be split into 2 subcategories. The first is specific to career and technical education as we know it. And the second, student-centered learning. For CTE, goals include updating our state Perkins plan, improved professional development for counselors around workforce opportunities, and improving career and technical student organization success. As it relates to the other area of student-centered learning, you may have recently read about an exciting partnership between the Department of Education, the Governor's Office, the State Board of Education, and the UW College of Education. We will soon be launching a series of pilots in school districts that will move away from the one-size-fits-all model of our traditional system. This will include competency-based learning, where students can move at their own pace, problem-based learning opportunities with real Wyoming companies, pathway options, and work-based opportunities where students can gain real work experience while still moving forward towards their diploma. The third initiative is citizenship, enhancing civics education so that our students know and understand the founding principles of our country and how to meaningfully engage in the system, as well as financial literacy education. Also, a student can only be a good citizen if they're well mentally, and we are committed to working with the mental health task force, as well as our Thrive framework, which you will hear about tomorrow. I believe that the focus in this area should be on the whole child and involve our parents. The fourth initiative area is in reducing bureaucracy and creating efficiencies. Coming from one of the most regulated industries in the country, I know firsthand that overburdensome regulations stifle innovation, and the same is true for our educators. So this will be including exploring broad regulatory reform in the system, creating efficiencies in our data collection, and updating the crew report so it more accurately tells the story of our districts and better assists you all in policy decisions. The fifth initiative is valuing and supporting teachers. You're all very aware of the teacher shortage in Wyoming and across the country and have the topic on your agenda tomorrow. The Teacher Retention and Recruitment Task Force, which was launched in January, has been hard at work. And we also administered a teacher survey, which garnered nearly 4,000 responses. Additionally, we plan to develop a principal leadership component of our statewide system of support, initiate a tour of excellence and other ways to highlight great teachers to the public, and continue to work with the Board of Education to prioritize and to reduce our standards load. The sixth and final initiative area is early literacy. This initiative can also be split into two categories, K-3 literacy and early childhood. This is, of course, an interim topic for the committee, and there will be greater discussion on both of those later today. When it comes to literacy, I believe that we have a great opportunity and obligation to get on the same page about what we mean by literacy proficiency, which assessments are most appropriate, whether it be screeners or the YTOP assessment, and what our goals for the state are, from growth rates to overall proficiency. Regarding early childhood education, you'll soon hear of the complexities around administration at the state level. It is my hope that we can create efficiencies across state agencies and also identify potential changes to statute that can better support our child development centers so they can be more successful. With that, I look forward to working with each and every one of you on these goals and your work in the interim, and I look forward to updating you on the work of the cabinets as they move forward. With that, Mr. Chairman, I would stand for questions.
Very good. Thank you. Looking forward to seeing it and get rolled out. Anybody have questions, comments, questions? Go ahead. Chairman Scott.
Mr. Chairman, one of the things that caught my attention was when you mentioned working on the crew reports. And I want to urge you that that is a important thing. Those things are very difficult to use to figure out what's actually going on. And if you can find a way to simplify them and make more sense out of them, that's would be a great benefit, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, as you're keenly aware, whenever we discuss the crew report, there's a long line of individuals that speak about all the caveats in the report, and those exist. So how we can create a more comprehensive report that really tells that story, I think, is going to lead to stronger policy decisions. Thank you.
Go ahead.
I'm also gratified to see the emphasis on the grade 3 English language arts, that because we've been criticized rightly, I think, in the last recalibration report, the consultants said basically we weren't getting our money's worth in that area, and that we were not adequately preparing too many of our students for the modern high-tech economy, because they were essentially not learning how to read adequately in those first 3 grades. And Mr. Chairman, I'm glad to see that as a point of emphasis here, because so much of the rest of education, as you well know, hangs on that. So again, I wish to compliment this effort, as that's a key feature.
Anybody else have anything you'd like to add? Go ahead, Representative Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Superintendent. Appreciate your hard work. My question is, as you looked at your goals for early literacy, especially with young kids, did the topic ever come up at maybe taking a look at our compulsory attendance laws for that age group and what the statutes are saying there.
Good point. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Berger, I think anything and everything related to the early childhood pipeline, we're going to be looking at because, we know that this impacts literacy, and we know that literacy is a very strong indicator in success of a graduate and in their future life. And so, we're going to leave no stone unturned in that area.
Go ahead, Representative Brown.
Just a quick question, Superintendent, thank you for being here. Appreciate you showing up. My question really surrounds on the idea of when you're looking at these partnering with parents and everything to try to make more personalized individual experiences. I know it's very tough, and I appreciate the nimbleness of having a smaller committee or cabinet, as you call it, versus getting that impact with everybody across the board. What districts are you looking at? Are you looking at districts that are doing this really well? Are you looking at districts that are struggling in that area to bring them on? Because when I look at this, I know some districts are already doing this and they're doing a very good job with this. So how does that look? How is that formulation of that 10 to 15 member cabinet chosen, specifically when you're talking about these partnering with parents and making this a more personalized education experience?
Go ahead, Madam Superintendent.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, absolutely. That was very center of my mind when looking at these cabinets and making sure that we are sharing that information across the state. As I traveled, 40,000 miles across the state this summer, recognizing that we have many pockets of excellence where a lot of these things are happening. But how do we, in such a rural state, make sure that we're connecting those school districts where maybe they haven't executed that or not done so as well? And so a lot of that is going to be information sharing and making sure, again, that in all of this, we're providing model guidance and policy to school districts to really make it their own. And so as you'll see too, this week launching the application process for those pilots with the partnership between the several different agencies. We're really sending those out statewide, and the application process is meant to get a feel for where districts lie in those different areas and meeting them and recognizing that we're going to have to be individual to our partnership with the districts. It can't be a one-size-fits-all model. Our school districts, our communities are too different. And so that was a very relevant conversation that we had within that group. So absolutely, I agree with you, and we'll be looking at that.
Representative Provenza.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for this. On your third goal with the enhancing civics education engagement, I'm kind of curious if you could elaborate more on what that would look like.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, great question, because that is one of the more broad goals. And you'll see that some of these goals are very specific and some of them are more broad. And that's because, we really haven't scratched the surface much in what that looks like. There's a lot of great initiatives going on in the state as it relates to civics education, but bringing all of those entities together to really discuss how do we streamline that and make sure that's going out. And so that cabinet really includes folks that are doing a lot of this work in different ways, different nonprofit organizations. And so, I think that one is broad so that it can be flexible so we can figure out what works and what people are. We don't want to reinvent the wheel in any of this.
Go ahead, follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, just in talking with my school board and having conversations with civics education folks there, a lot of the emphasis is on kind of the higher level federal, national, like political sphere, right? And what I see at the university are a lot of people coming in not knowing what a state legislature is or how to engage with city council. And so that's something that my school district has kind of looked at in terms of how do we make this more Wyoming, I guess. So that's my only comment, I guess, into that would be if we can find a way to have more localized education on government, that would be lovely. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I absolutely agree. And, I think that's exactly what we'll be looking at. I think it will also include involvement, this goal, more than maybe any of the others, involvement in the community and how we engage with the different groups of government or industries within a community. And so we've looked at a lot of ways of how we make it more of a community-based project. And I think that's going to include partnership with the legislature as well, and how we get more legislators into schools with students, and really just how we all come together on this and make sure that our students know about Wyoming and that they can engage in the system.
Go ahead. Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Superintendent. And I appreciate the opportunity that we had to talk through a lot of these concepts, and we share a lot of the same objectives and look forward to working with you on that. But one that we discussed a little bit, and I see how it came out, relates to the concepts of eliminating political bias, which is in the first provision. And that's an interest we certainly share. There shouldn't be political bias in schools. There should be an objective marketplace of ideas. But then looking through the goals, I have some concern regarding, for example, develop a political commitment, a public commitment to ensuring divisive and inappropriate concepts like critical race theory are not being taught, which honestly, I mean, as a first approximation, is effectively an expression of political bias, where that is an interest of one political party and not an interest of another political party, as well as the idea of identifying what is and isn't a divisive or inappropriate concept. And for that matter, teaching divisive concepts honestly can often be a good thing in an education system, and that might be subject to parental choice and political bias in and of itself. So, Mr. Chairman, the question I have, Superintendent, the aspiration is a solid aspiration, but how do we get to the point where even in the guiding principles, there is political difference and there would be political disagreement with whether these are objective statements? How do we actually move towards a system where we're eliminating political bias under these types of parameters?
Go ahead, Superintendent.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, I think that the key first step is transparency. And really having a fully transparent system that, again, is done so through the state and not an extra burden on teachers. And that's why I want to look at launching a transparency website where we have information available to parents, to taxpayers across the state. And so their parents can begin to, again, meaningfully engage in their school systems with their teachers, and get back to how we were pre-pandemic and before some of these controversial issues. For me, political agendas of any kind do not belong in the classroom. If we do, of any kind, our education system fails. And so I think transparency is really key in that. And I think, the work of the stakeholder cabinet in defining some of these terms and what we mean by them, and making sure that we're coming together along with the school districts, the state, the school districts, to really push back against political agenda in the classroom. So I think transparency is the first step. And these are tough issues, but we're not shying away from them. I'm rolling up my sleeves and we're getting to work because it is what I heard on the campaign trail. It was a concern of voters. And so we're going to do it the Wyoming way. We're going to work through these and make sure that political bias isn't in the classroom.
Mr. Chairman, quick follow-up.
Certainly, follow-up.
But specifically on this, where if you have a goal that is intrinsically politically biased as a component of eliminating political bias, how can transparency or even additional input solve that? I guess I would ask, did you run each of these goals by diverse enough political spectrum where everyone was agreeing that, yes, we absolutely need to do that? Because I feel as a representative of about a quarter of the state's population that I can comfortably say that would be a politically divisive statement for about a quarter of the population. What are your thoughts on that?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, I would have to disagree with that. I'd have to disagree that the goal is political. The point of the goal is to make sure that there are not any of those political biases. As you mentioned, critical race theory itself is one particular area where it's one political party, versus the other on that. And so the idea here is to eliminate all of that. And so I guess I don't view it that way.
Okay, and Mr. Chairman, the final question, and then I'll let the superintendent go, is the beauty of this back and forth and our disagreement on it is a little bit of difference in opinion. And in fact, I think that would demonstrate that there is a matter of different reflections on that and might not be consensus. So I guess I would ask, and I know that this is something that you've committed to, that you engage with a broad political spectrum as parts of your cabinet to ensure that it's not just resonating with the majority, but also reflects the minority. Otherwise, it would potentially show intrinsic bias. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, absolutely. And, my scheduler could tell you that I meet with anyone that calls, anyone that emails. I am open and available to talk to any stakeholder in the state of Wyoming. And so we'll work through these together. I just, for me, it's delivering on what I promised on the campaign trail and making sure that we move forward on those concerns that were expressed as I traveled to every inch of the state. So thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Superintendent. Appreciate did you have a question?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. If
All right.
the other committee members are through.
I believe everybody is. Go ahead, sir.
Okay. On the first item, the first bullet point under it, you talk about securing a vendor to create statewide curriculum and materials website. Are you, let me see if I understand that. Are you going to simply post the materials that the various districts are using as a curriculum? Are you talking about creating a statewide curriculum? Because it could be read that way. And is this item going to require a specific legislative appropriation to implement? What are you really talking about there? Because I think it's confusing.
Go ahead.
Sure. Mr. Chairman, Senator, great question. I'll answer the first based on funding. We do have some COVID relief dollars that we'll look at exploring to really pilot this and see if it is something that is valuable to Wyoming citizens. My vision for this is to have a one-stop shop where parents and taxpayers can access the curriculum that's occurring within school districts, not creating a statewide curriculum by any means. A lot of this does exist in different programs that the districts use. And so being able to use technology to pull directly from their systems to have that curriculum within this centralized place. And then looking at also, the ability to have interactive aspects of it. If there's political agenda in the classroom, if it's happening, I want to see it. And superintendents have articulated that to me as well. We want to see it and we want to be able to do something with it. And so how we make sure that we're really, again, that maximum transparency, maximum communication, that's what we do here in Wyoming. We talk to each other, we work through it. And so that's what this is meant to do.
We've used quite a bit of time on this subject,
Yes.
sir.
Okay, go ahead.
Are you? Okay, all right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Superintendent. We certainly appreciate your willingness to come before us. Thank you. Okay, so now we're at reviewing responsibilities and expectations for local school boards, which we're going to have Kevin Mitchell and Brian Farmer. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Brian Farmer with Wyoming School Boards Association. With me is Dr. Kevin Mitchell, the Executive Director of the Wyoming Association of School Administrators. Mr. Chairman, have a PowerPoint of some things that I'd like to share with you. But the PowerPoint really is something for later reference, later information, future guidance. I will go through it, but the short answer, the responsibilities of local school boards is the Green Books. You can go to Title 21 specifically, Article 3, 110 is where you'll find so much of this. But Mr. Chairman, I want to begin talking just about school boards and the origin of school boards. Why do we have school boards? And I will tell you, it was in the mid-1600s that the Massachusetts Bay Colony began an experiment. This was the first time in the world that we had a public school system. The Massachusetts Bay Colony created a public school system, and as an important component of a public school system, they had a board of selectmen to oversee that education system. So really, from before the time we were a country through today, school boards have been an important part of public education, and public education has been an important part of the fabric of our country. Mr. Chairman, Thomas Jefferson really became a proponent of this notion of public schools and public school boards as he created the University of Virginia in the early 1800s. Mr. Jefferson believed in the idea of public schooling and the public oversight of those schools. Jefferson said, I think by far the most important bill in the whole of our code is that for the diffusion of knowledge among the people. No other sure foundation can be devised for the preservation of freedom and happiness. And so schools and school boards are a part really of that American fabric. So we get to Wyoming, and in our territorial days, we had, as most states and most territories did, we had a system of public schools and oversight of those schools by school boards. Wyoming codified school boards in our state statutes, and again at 21.3, I'm sorry, that says 101, it should be 110. 101 does establish the district as a body corporate. In other words, school districts have legal authority to act on their own. They are their own legal entities. And then at 21.3.105, it says that the school board or the board of trustees of the district is the governing body of that district. Now, Mr. Chairman, the great thing about school boards is that school boards are elected officials. These are folks that are elected by the community, and the school board only makes decisions as a body. It's much like the legislature. Individual legislators don't direct and dictate law. School boards only do it when they work together, when they act in a public meeting of the Board of Trustees, and all action must require a majority of the members elected to the Board of Trustees. One of the unique pieces of school boards is that school boards serve without compensation. So our school boards, our board members are volunteering their time to be that public voice in public education without compensation for what they do. Our school boards are guided by a board chairman. The board chairman presides over meetings, and they have to take action in accordance with the Wyoming Public Meetings Act. So action means any collective decision, collective commitment or promise to make a positive or negative decision, or an actual vote at a meeting. And the meeting has to be an assembly of at least a quorum of the board, which has been called by the proper authority for the express purpose of discussion, deliberation, presentation of information, or taking action regarding public business. Those terms come right from our Public Meetings Act. So in other words, the boards are doing what they are required to do under Wyoming statute, to act as a body, making decisions to guide the school district on behalf of the public. Some of the places throughout Wyoming law that are important to look are the duties of the boards of trustees found at 21.3.110. And if you look at that, there's over 39 duties listed in that statute alone. The powers of the boards of trustees are at 21.3.111, immediately following. The Wyoming Public Meetings Act, the Public Records Act, and the Wyoming Ethics and Disclosure are all important to school board governance. Though I will say statutes throughout our Wyoming code are important to the governance of school boards. So, Mr. Chairman, on some of the slides I've listed, I've just taken a sampling of some of the duties. Again, there's 39 of the specific duties listed in 21.3.10, but some of those are things like developing policies, keeping minutes as a record of actions, fixing the date and time, or fixing the time and place of regular meetings so that the public is aware of when the board meets, and the public can observe those meetings. There are certain things that must be filed with the state. Wyoming has extensive reporting requirements, which leads to Wyoming having some of the best data on education in the nation. We're required to estimate what it's going to cost to run a school district and what taxes would be necessary for the administration of the school system. They have a responsibility for facilities. They have a responsibility to consider petitions that they receive from the public. They are required to make an accounting of all receipts and expenditures. They're required to provide a uniform education in compliance with state standards. School districts are required to publish certain things. They're required to ensure that teachers are teaching correctly and that they're evaluating teachers and leaders. Now, beyond the duties, school districts have certain powers, and again, those powers are listed in 21.3.111, and we've listed out, again, just a sampling of some of those powers. You'll find that statute articulates more powers, but again, as a body corporate, they are required to do certain things like, or empowered to do certain things like holding property, entering into agreements, employing legal counsel and bearing costs of litigation, accepting or rejecting any federal or other gifts, grants, bequests, or devises. They employ a superintendent, teachers, principals, certified personnel, and other personnel, and determine salaries appropriate for those individuals. They have the ability to discharge employees subject to state law. They must insure against the loss of property. They can become members of school boards associations, provide for the operations of a school lunch program, require an officer or employee to handle funds on behalf of the district to be bonded, convey property, define unexcused absences, and habitual truancy. Mr. Chairman, I think it's really important, again, when talking about school boards, to recognize that the school board only acts as a board. So when they're together, it is a majority of the board, a majority of those elected, that is necessary for action. So, Mr. Chairman, if you have, say, a 7-member board and 2 members are absent, and you have a 3-2 vote, while that is a majority of those present, it is not a majority of those elected to the board. And so it does require a majority of those elected to the board. We have 5, 7, and 9-member boards in Wyoming, and I wish I could tell you that there was rhyme or reason as to the size of those. The reality is that they are an artifact of the last reorganization of school districts that we had. So the 9-member districts, or those that have 9-member boards, are typically the results of consolidations that happened in the past. People wanted to keep voices from those consolidated districts. And Mr. Chairman, the law is incredibly cumbersome to go from, say, 9 members down to 7, should a district desire to do that. So Niobrara County, our smallest populated county in the state, has talked about how do we go from 9 to 7 because the process at law is so cumbersome to do that. No district has pursued that change. Mr. Chairman, there are consequences should a school board member fail to perform their duty. They are subject to misdemeanor and fine should they fail to perform duties as a member of the board, as well as a period of not more than 30 days of imprisonment. So it's serious business to be a member of the board. The board takes an oath of their office. There are some penalties and restrictions should a person fail again to do the things that they are required to do. And so some of these statutes or regulations are spread out throughout statutes, but we've provided, again, some samplings of restrictions and penalties that board members may be subjected to in their office. So again, I think it underscores and emphasizes these are elected officials elected by the public to be that public voice, and being that public voice in public education, they have high requirements, high responsibility in doing their work. Mr. Chairman, there really are 5 basic jobs of the school board. The 5 basic jobs are what we often refer to as the key work of the school board. The first of those is to create a vision for the system. And that vision must reflect the community's beliefs and priorities for the educational system. Again, that's the public voice in public education. And then they allocate resources to meet that vision. So the dollars, the budget, the people are allocated in order to meet the vision of the district. And that's the beauty that we have in Wyoming, is with our 48 different school districts, we're able to have something that fits each of our communities. Accountability is the next key job of a school board, and that's holding the system accountable, taking measures for how we are doing as a district, and then relying on that data for governance, for decision-making, for allocation of resources. The next key job of the school board is to establish policies, to direct the district through the policy of the district. Mr. Chairman, from time to time, there's been discussion about, does the word policy or does the word rule matter in statute? And the truth of the matter is that the majority of school districts follow the Wyoming Administrative Procedures Act in the adoption of policy. Therefore, they are compliant with the requirement for a rule. So in effect, most of the time, it doesn't matter. Rule is when something must go through an articulated procedure, something equivalent to the Wyoming Administrative Procedures Act. And that does include a longer process, a notice and an opportunity for the public to be involved. But again, the normal policymaking process of a school district allows for that anyway. Community leadership is another important job. To be both an advocate as well as one engaged with the community creates a two-way communication with stakeholders that are both internal and external to the system. And then the final job of the board is to work with their superintendent as their person that they direct to be the chief administrator of the educational system. So each has their role and their responsibility for success of the district. Mr. Chairman, I think one of the beautiful things about a board and the beautiful things about Wyoming school boards is that the diversity of ideas, the different perspectives, allow for a lot of voices to be heard and the consideration of different perspectives when making policy, when allocating resources, and when conducting the business of the district. There has been research done to determine, do school boards make a difference? And the answer to that is yes, they can. School boards can impact student achievement if they engage in certain behaviors. So I have tried to summarize what we often call the 8 characteristics of effective school boards. Those 8 characteristics are again supported by research. But we know that if boards engage in these behaviors, that they have a chance to impact student achievement. So a commitment to the learning and development of the board itself to have knowledge and understanding of the school system. Communication with stakeholders to establish high expectations for student achievement and quality instruction and define clear goals toward that vision. School boards need to be accountable, spending less time on operational issues and more time focused on policies to improve student achievement while monitoring data to drive continuous improvement. School districts that are aligned and sustained to meet those district goals and communicate with their constituents about how we're doing on achievement of those goals have the opportunity to impact achievement. and school boards that recognize the roles and responsibilities of all of the stakeholders in the system and how that is responsible for the success of our students. So really, I guess the last thing I'd like to say about school boards is, again, we oftentimes hear that we need to hear from parents, we need to hear from business people, we need to hear from taxpayers, and that's all absolutely true. But Mr. Chairman, we have board members that represent those perspectives. The majority of people elected to school boards are parents of children in school systems or have had children through the school system. The majority of school board members represent Wyoming business people, and they were elected by their public to be these representatives. So, Mr. Chairman, while we do seek to partner with all stakeholders, the board is that unique American experience of electing a public oversight of the educational system, and then that board being accountable for the performance of the system. Mr. Chairman, I know as you work through this process that school boards are an important partner to the legislature in how do we carry out the ideas. The legislature's role is to kind of tell us about what we are to carry out in the school system. The school board is the one to ensure that it is carried out. So we look forward to partnerships with the legislature in ways that we can work together ultimately for the success of Wyoming school children. We oftentimes talk about Wyoming's great resources, the minerals and the other fantastic resources Wyoming is blessed with. But Mr. Chairman, our truly greatest resource in our state is our school children. And there is not a better job in the state of Wyoming than being that elected school board member who's not paid, whose only payment comes about this time of year when they watch those graduates walk across the stage and they know what I did made a difference. Mr. Chairman, I know that Mr. Mitchell has a few comments. After that, we would be happy to take any questions from the committee.
Go ahead, Mr. Mitchell.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Kevin Mitchell, just a little bit of background. I was a superintendent in Wyoming for 16 years in 2 different school districts in northern Wyoming. I just want to share the responsibilities that Mr. Farmer has shared really lie on the shoulders of the superintendent. Boards are elected to govern, but they're not employees of the school district. They hire a superintendent to help them fulfill those duties and responsibilities. We just kind of touched a tip of the iceberg here. Not only do we have all these state statutes, but there are 40-some chapters of rules and regulations that the Department of Education has. And I don't know how many thousands of pages of federal law and rules and regulations that a school district is held accountable to. Those all fall singly on the shoulders of the superintendent of that school district and the staff that they hire. The board hires the superintendent hires the rest of the staff. And so that relationship between the superintendent and the board is absolutely critical to not only fulfilling the responsibilities, but leading that district, and in particular, to meet the needs of every child in that district. So I just want to share with you, sometimes superintendents can get hit pretty hard about what do they do, and they make too much money. There's not too many people that run an organization and a system that's as complicated as the school system in Wyoming. It's a very complicated system to work through with all the federal, state, and local guidance. So once again, the Wyoming Association of School Administrators also has had a long-standing partnership with this committee. I was counting today, I think I've been coming to these meetings for 25 years and hardly ever missed a meeting. Used to testify frequently before this committee years ago. So we appreciate the work that you do. And at any time you need anything from us, please reach out and we'll try to do the best to give you the information that you need. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Lawley has a question. Go ahead, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you guys for being here and appreciate the information that you shared. And being on a school board is not an easy job. It's an important job, and I really thank you for pointing that out. But I do want to raise a concern from my constituents about the responsiveness of school boards to the concerns of citizens. And back to a comment you made, Mr. Farmer, about open meetings, and you're correct in your observation of there's a difference between a public meeting and a meeting that happens in public, and that this idea of people can come and observe. I find a lot of frustration with my constituents about that dynamic and wanting to have more of a collaborative effort as issues come before the board that are of particular significance to the citizens. And I'm not suggesting anyone's not complying with the Open Records or Open Meeting Act. I'm just posing the idea that there might be a disconnect. There might be a need for more responsiveness of school boards. And so what would your solution be to that concern of citizens that feel like that they don't have that avenue to communicate, and that school boards aren't opening up through maybe work meetings and things like that, where there can be a little bit more input from the public on a particular issue of concern? What is your response to what we could do about those concerns of citizens that want to be involved in the process of some of the things, policies of the school district?
Who would like to take that on?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Mitchell or Dr. Mitchell can begin, and I'll follow up.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Lawley, I think that that's a procedural issue, and I know that you're not going to hear that, but don't want to hear that, but there's an avenue for the public to get on the agenda for a school board meeting, and that, in my role in 16 years, I don't think any time that we've ever had a patron asked to be on the agenda for a school board meeting to get on the agenda and speak, unless it was specifically a personnel issue about one person. What I think the issue is people just want to show up whenever they want to show up and speak about whatever they want to speak up, however they want to speak up. And that's not how boards are governed. They have a system in place. So part of that is educating the public, and here is how I do get to speak in public in front of a board, same as here, that that there's a request to speak. And so I think that's part of the responsibility, that people just think they can come to a meeting and talk whenever they want to, and that's not how it's run. But they can. Like I say, working with the chairman, Representative Northrup was the chairman of the school board in one of the districts that I worked at. And when we had a citizen want to come speak before the board, we added them to the agenda.
Can follow up.
Go ahead, follow up.
I'm aware of those, and I understand they're there, and I think many citizens are learning, and that is a good thing. But there are times when the awareness of the citizens with what's going to be discussed at a school board meeting, coupled with the requirements of those processes, don't match up well, and there's frustration. So I think that's what I'm trying to address, is what can we do to address those frustrations and keep those processes more open, and perhaps even there's something the legislature should speak to about the responsiveness to citizens. I don't necessarily know what that is, but I do appreciate what you said and agree that, and I have tried to even educate people concerning those processes, but they don't always serve, from the citizens' point of view, well, the citizens' ability to interact with the boards, to be all that you talked about, and they aspire to be, and we all want them to be. So again, that's a way maybe we can partner to figure out how to address that, because it seems to be becoming something I'm hearing more and more. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, just follow up in response. I think if you watch government over time, citizens are disaffected with different pieces of government from time to time. Today, you may hear complaints about the legislature. Tomorrow, it might be city or town council. After that, county commissioners or the legislature itself, and a frustration with the public's participation in any of that. Does the legislature represent me? Does the county commission care about what I think? And I think that responsibility, or the highest office that we have in America, is probably the office of citizen. What is the role of citizen in engaging in their community? I will say, having been an elected school board member, I felt that my highest responsibility was engaging my public. Because our school board meetings are time limited, I spent a tremendous amount of time talking with my constituents, when I was in that role, in that office. And I think that is a key for members of the community to have that accessibility. I'm certain you, as members of the legislature, spend inordinate amounts of times talking and communicating with your constituents. And so I think that's just an important piece of the process, is that openness for that constant communication with elected officials at all levels, in all places. And then boards having that opportunity for comment and for that continued engagement. The other piece I will say is that we've oftentimes seen at a board meeting, when there's a substantial issue with a member of the community, oftentimes that member is directed to have further conversation with the superintendent. Mr. Farmer, why don't you set an appointment with Dr. Mitchell? Talk with Dr. Mitchell about your concerns, and then if you don't feel they're being addressed, come back to us as a board and let us know. That way, again, the board is serving its role in governance, directing the community concern to the staff, and in offering that opportunity for engagement. And I know our Wyoming superintendents spend a great deal of time, again, with their constituents as well. So while there may be opportunities for improvement in the process, I think the best thing all of us can do is improve our communication.
Representative Berger, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Mr. Farmer, is it fair to say, or safe to say, that these local school districts or public boards are public charters of the state?
Go ahead, sir.
Mr. Chairman, how one characterizes different branches or bodies or pieces of government is difficult. Sometimes people have referred to a district as an arm of the state. Certainly, the school district gets its authority from the state. The state grants that authority through statute, spells out what the extent of that authority is, but as a body corporate, they're enabled to act as their own legal entity. So the buck stops with the school board. Sometimes people call up Wyoming School Boards Association and say, can't you get our school board in line? Can't you get something in line? Maybe you've got those calls as a legislator, but the answer is the buck stops with the elected school board. But that school board's authority, its responsibility and its power is only to the extent as authorized by the Wyoming legislature.
Thank you. And follow up?
Yes.
Just the last quick one.
Yep.
Are they held, and it sounds like that they're held to a high standard, these boards and districts. Am I correct?
Mr. Chairman, Wyoming school boards oftentimes adopt their own code of ethic or code of conduct. They are certainly subject to the Wyoming Ethics and Disclosure Law, as are all elected officials. But there is, I guess the high standard question is a relative one. We do not have as extensive of ethics requirements in Wyoming as, say, the state of Ohio does. Ohio has more explicit, more voluminous requirements for ethics than Wyoming does. So I think it is the board holding itself to that high standard through its code of conduct. It's a policy adopted by the board itself.
Co-Chairman Scott has a couple questions. Go ahead, sir.
Mr. Chairman, one comment and one question. Mr. Farmer said that the boards, school boards can impact student achievement. And I'd like to underscore that and say that we've been working on the K-3 literacy issue. And I've become absolutely convinced that a major difference in the success in the K-3 education has been the dedication of the local superintendent and the school board. If they want good results there, they're getting them. If they don't care, they're not getting the good results. And I think you can see it in the results. That's a place, key place, where the school boards and the superintendent in combination locally are making a big difference, Mr. Chairman. Question is, Mr. Farmer said it was very cumbersome to change the size of a district board. My question to you is, is this an important enough problem that we ought to consider dealing with that legislatively with a committee bill to simplify that process? Or is it only affecting one or two districts where perhaps a private bill by the appropriate senators and representatives might be the best way to solve it? Or is it simply not enough people wanting to change the size that it's cumbersome, but so what? Nobody wants to do it.
Go ahead, Brian.
Mr. Chairman, the short answer, easy answer is better to go with individual bill at this time. If we were entering a general session, maybe committee time. But I believe with your priorities you have for this interim, time better served on those.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Very good. Further questions for the pair? Go ahead, Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brian, just out of curiosity, you know, at the end of every meeting or at the end of every topic here, we always open up for public comment. And I know that at least in my district that's not necessarily the case. And we don't have to go through all 48 districts. That's certainly not what I'm looking for. But one of the things that I think Representative Lawley was mentioning, and it kind of coincides with something that I've heard from my constituents as well, is you know, we're going to place the public comment of our board meetings up front, get it in and out of the way, and then we're going to go do our business. But truly what happens in the business is where the public comment wants to be heard. And some of that discussion needs to be kind of countered, right? And so there's that feeling of inadequacy that if I come to a board meeting, my voice isn't being heard because I'm basically being charged first and then shoved out the door. I don't get a chance to meet. So beyond that, what are some of the best practices you've seen across the state with other districts that do this in a different fashion, where we do actually see, to Representative Lawley's point, that the parents and the public feel engaged in the process when there is a school board process going through? Because as I heard, I know the school boards are doing this to get rich, right? The people who are serving here are certainly doing this to get rich, but I think there's a serious point to be made here, and especially over the past 3 years, what we've seen is these people are volunteering. I mean, they put their name on a ballot, they run, they're doing this. But I also want it to be known that the parents need to be heard as well. And I think, to Representative Lawley's point, there's maybe stagnation in the way that boards have done business in the past. So what are some of the best practices you guys have seen across the state?
So, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
There's a number of things. I would say the size and complexity of district is certainly an artifact in some of this. If you think about just your meeting, you have a very packed agenda. I would imagine that it will be tight for public comment, even in this meeting, in the limited opportunity you have over 2 days, full days. School boards don't meet that long. They don't engage for that long of a period of time. And again, many of the contacts you'll have with constituents come outside of the meeting itself. So I think we have school boards that do public comment at the beginning. We have school boards that do public comment at the end. We have school boards that do public comment at the beginning and the end. And we have school boards that offer that interim or intermittently throughout the meeting. But that oftentimes then coincides with the business of the district to get done. Do they have, does that fit into the time frame to do business? So we are seeing more and more of our school boards that used to just meet for once a month that are considering additional meetings for opportunities for engagement. Probably the best practice that we see, and one that I think a lot of school districts try to do, is they present something as information at one meeting and then make a decision on that at a subsequent meeting. So it is put before the board and before the public in advance of a decision that's to be made later, with the idea that both the board and the public can engage in greater conversation between those two meetings. And so, for example, in Pine Bluffs, Laramie County School District number 2, they have what they call a committee of the whole meeting, which is just the presentation of information at one meeting a month. And then the second meeting, they do consideration of business. Again, sometimes with the size, the complexity of a district, you need to make decisions fast because things are moving fast. That's not always possible But, where possible, I think putting things out there for consideration, providing time is a way of doing that. Having what's known as work sessions or workshops, opportunities for ideas to be explored outside of the decision-making is another practice that you see among boards. And then where possible, some boards are engaging in that public comment after topics or before votes. So all of those things do happen.
Quickly, okay.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And it's actually more of just a statement to your point, and thank you for that, Mr. Farmer. I'd say that the biggest thing that I see on both sides that needs to be adjusted as well is respect. And it's the same thing on this dais and on the outside here, that these people are volunteering, right? And so when there's a school board meeting, that there's respect on both sides of the dais. And I think that's probably the issue that I see the most right now, is that there's a feeling of no respect from one side. But it can be done on both sides. So I would just say, to your point, thank you for the information about Laramie County too. I like that idea. And maybe that's something that we can look forward to. I don't think it's anything legislative we have to fix, but to your point, I think the biggest issue is parents and school board members all just need to offer each other a little more respect and a little more grace. Thank you.
You have a question? No. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Then we'll move into public comment. But before we do that, I'd like to acknowledge Lachelle Brandt from the governor's office. Hi, Lachelle. Also, Representative Sweeney's here and Representative Schwartz is here. All right, anybody have any public comment on anything we talked about this morning? Public comment going once. Oh, come on up. Remember to state your name and then go for it. Oh, got to make sure it's green light. There you. Oh, it's so close. There you go.
Thank you, Chairman. Hi, good morning. My name is Jennifer Hopkins. I have been in schooling for 25 years with my children who have attended private, public, and homeschool. I have been keeping up with what is going on with the schools for several years. I'm a current school board member, but I am not speaking on behalf of the schools. I'm here as a citizen. True elementary education has not changed in over 100 years. Children need to learn reading through a phonetic process, grammar, and comprehension from quality literature. Math needs to be basic and requires memorization. History, geography, and science needs to be as close to the original source as possible. The rest of the subjects that our legislature or Wyoming Department of Education requires not need to be a part of the standard. Stop making children a product of bureaucratic system and a product of quality, and they need to be a product of quality education. What I have observed so far is that graduates of the College of Education are not equipped to teach phonetics, the basic structure of the English language. The district is responsible for paying additional schooling in this subject matter. I believe that continued surveys delays the much needed teaching of our current students. Going back to the elementary of education, teaching from a mastery perspective from K to 5th to 6th grade ensures that any child that may have some holes will have the opportunity to learn. Thank you.
Two questions. First, which school district are you from?
Natrona.
Okay,
But I'm not here to represent Natrona County. Yeah.
understand.
Go ahead, sir.
And Mr. Chairman, let's say I do need to talk to you offline. I wanted to ask one question about the teachers not being equipped to teach phonics. One of the things we've seen and heard testimony about is that there are multiple systems for teaching reading then, and the school district would typically employ a system. I think we may employ more than one here in Casper, but that it's very important to teach the teachers the specifics of that system and train the teachers in that. And that's beyond, there's 100 or so, those more on the market. So it's beyond what a school of education can do. So are we really seeing that graduates are not properly equipped to teach phonics? Or is it a more detailed issue where they need training that the school district will have to provide on the specifics of the systems that are in use locally that they're actually teaching in? Because the two are related, but different, if you see what I mean, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Jennifer.
Okay, I'll try, but I'm a volunteer. So I think over the years, from what I understand, is that we're taking bits and pieces of the phonetic system. So it was a full program, and so it may be that I might be scattered a little bit on this. So if you have teachers that are like in the elementary education, they should have a full view of how to teach the phonics. Not the bits and pieces or bits of a program here and a program there, because you know what, I left the book downstairs in my car, and it's called 100 Easy Lessons to Learn How to Read. It's a full book, and I wish I would have brought it up here so you can look at. So it's just, I guess the district could take that on too, but wouldn't it be easier on the district if the teacher was already equipped for teaching the full phonics viewpoint? What was the other question you said? Did that help answer? I mean.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, I guess what I'm wondering, and there may be a problem with some of the teachers, because the university had to reform its School of Education a few years ago. So some of the earlier teachers, there may have been some problems with the instruction they got, Mr. Chairman. But what I was trying to get at, was it really a problem with the teacher being prepared to teach phonics, or was it a problem with the teacher being prepared to teach the specific system that a school district was using, or in this case, a school was using?
I recently heard that some of our teachers were being sent. Well, my concern was because when I first was concerned about this, is that we were told that our teachers were being sent to learn to teach the children to read. That means that they weren't coming out of the schools equipped, that they were coming here, and then we're sending them to be taught how to teach this. Now, I'm sure they're getting something, but another concern is that we're not seeing it like, they might get a little bit of in kindergarten or first and second grade, but to teach the whole phonics, I mean, the English language is complicated, to a certain extent, and that we have to keep teaching it from kindergarten to even sometimes sixth grade, the repetitiveness, so our children really understand to read. And sometimes children don't really learn in the first or second grade or the third grade when we think that, they should be learning, that sometimes that's going to click with them a little later. So if we continue from the beginning and keep repeating those concepts all the way up to sometimes sixth grade, then they're not going to have any holes. And it's a very, it's simple. It's just the repetitiveness of the phonics, the grammar, the good literature, all those coincide with each other. I had one other thing to say, but it slipped my mind. Is there any other questions?
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Ms. Hopkins, let me
Yes.
talk to you offline.
Yes,
at the
that would
break.
be great. I would love to do that. Thank you.
That sounds great. All right. Thank you, Ms. Hopkins. Anybody else have a question for her? We appreciate your testimony. Thank you. Would anybody else like to give public testimony on anything we've covered this morning? Now we'll go going once, going twice. All right, we'll be on break for 10 minutes at 10:20. We'll be back here and get back on schedule, closer. Thank you. If I could get everybody to take a seat, we'll start back up again. Oh, yeah. Sit down.
He's always going to be a thing. Oh, yeah.
We'll call this meeting back to order. And we are on early childhood programs. We're going to have an overview from Shelley Hamill, Stephanie Johansson, Roxanne O'Connor, Holly McCamey Simone, wow, and Lachelle Brandt. Thank you. Who would like to start this off?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I will start, and it sounds like you did the hard work for me already, so thank you getting through those names. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Roxanne O'Connor, and I'm the Support Services Senior Administrator for Department of Family Services. With us today, we have a full roster of state agencies who are going to speak to you on a very important topic, early care and education in Wyoming. And I think that through this presentation, you'll see the widespread impact and influence that early care and education has around the state and how it resonates and transpires through so many different sectors. And so we're excited to educate the committee on that and really call attention to that. So before we get into the presentation, I was going to let my colleagues introduce themselves briefly, and then we'll get started.
Sounds great.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and committee members. I'm Shelley Hamill, and I'm with the Wyoming Department of Education.
Good morning, committee members. My name is Matt Petrie. I'm the Senior Administrator of the Behavioral Health Division at the Department of Health.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. It's good to see you and members of the committee. My name's Lachelle Brandt, and I am the Senior Policy Advisor in the Office of Governor Gordon.
Well, thank you and welcome to all of you for coming here, and we're looking forward to learning something about early childhood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we also have Department of Workforce Services who will be presenting virtually, so they will present after I do the first part of the presentation.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I'm Holly Simone, I'm the Workforce Program Administrator.
Good morning.
So moving along, as we staffed this together and worked on this presentation together, we thought that it made the most sense in the way that we organized the presentation to really look at early care and education from the broadest scope and the broadest purview, and that was Department of Family Services through the licensing program and also through the Child Care Assistance Program. And then we're going to kick it over to Workforce Services to talk about workforce development and training and the economic impacts of early care and education. And then we're going to move down to the more specific program levels, and Department of Health and Department of Education will speak specifically to some specific programs in the state, TANF preschools, Title I preschools, and then IDEA programs. And so that's kind of the rationale behind the organization that we have here today. We've gone through the state entities who will be presenting. On slide 4, we did a brief overview table for you. This is just a quick at-a-glance slide for you to be able to see the programs that we'll be discussing, as well as some basic demographic information about the clients that are served and the funding that goes towards serving those populations. So we'll get more in depth on those through each of the presentations that we'll be going through here. So I will start off with Department of Family Services programs and how those relate to early care and education. You'll see here that we have our child care licensing statutory authority referenced. As you can see, that authority and that statutory reference is very broad. So it covers early care and education, the programs that we're talking about today, and the focus on our youngest youth in Wyoming. But as we've mentioned before in many committee meetings, that is such a broad statute that it also covers our substitute care or our congregate care facilities. And so the residential treatment centers, psychiatric residential treatment facilities, group homes also fall within the statutory authority. And I think that that's a really important note, just because we've looked at quite a few different types of exemptions over the past few years for childcare, and we've really had to research and look at making those pretty specific so that we don't inadvertently impact other programs while making exemptions to specific childcare programs. So that's just a highlight that we wanted to make, but we are going to talk specifically about licensed and non-licensed childcare programs within the state of Wyoming. We currently have 584 licensed childcare facilities in Wyoming with a capacity of about 21,000 children that can be served. Now, that is the maximum number. That's our full capacity. And of course, in order to serve that many children, you have to have staff to watch those little ones. And so we do have staffing ratios and group sizes to make sure that those numbers stay manageable. But just so you know, this is the peak number that we would have for youth served in all licensed childcare facilities, again, depending on staffing and square footage requirements, those types of things that you'll see. We have 3 different types of licensed childcare facilities in the state, and I'm going to start with the smallest. Those are family childcare homes. Those are home providers that can care for up to 10 children. Typically, you'll only see 1 or 2 staff members in a family childcare home. And then depending on square footage requirements, fire requirements, staffing requirements, a family child care home can develop into a family child care center, so still in the home, just have more children, up to 15 children, as long as they meet those staffing requirements. So there would have to be more than 1 staff person in a family child care center. And then our largest programs are child care centers, and they can take 16 or more children, again, depending on staffing requirements, square footage requirements, does their physical space account for that many children. And those are the biggest facilities that you will see around the state. Many of the child development centers that we'll be talking about later fall under that category. Something important to note is that we license based on the number of children served and how large the facility is, so the actual physical space. We don't license based on educational curriculum, or we don't license based on a preschool definition. We don't have a statewide preschool definition in the state, and so any of these types of programs can call themselves a preschool, and we won't come in and say, you're not a preschool because you don't follow this, that, or curriculum or anything like that. We do have quality standards within our rules from a professional development standpoint. So we have training requirements for child development and early learning standards for all staff that are credentialed to be in a child care program. But outside of that, we don't license or say that a program is a preschool program. On the next slide, you'll see a quick heat map of the number of licensed childcare facilities that we have across the state. We thought that that might be of interest to all of you from different communities. And now we can talk about who doesn't have to be licensed. So we have 4 types of childcare programs, and I emphasize childcare programs that are not required to be licensed. We have small programs that are typically in-home, and that's one individual serving either 2 children, 2 unrelated children, or 1 sibling group. So those are, kind of your neighbor, your family friend and neighbor type of programs that don't need to be licensed. We have before and after school programs that aren't required to be licensed, programs that are overseen by governmental entities or school districts. And then as of July, we will have part-time daycares with some restrictions on the number of hours that children are served in those programs, food preparation, medication distribution, diapering, and a maximum age limit on the children. So those really small kind of programs that only care for children a couple of hours a day will be exempt as well, again, coming July. It's important to note that the state, so Department of Family Services, only knows about exempt providers for providers who accept childcare assistance. So for those providers that serve children and families who are on childcare assistance. Otherwise, out of this list of entities, we wouldn't know about them, right? They're not required to be known to us. They're not required to register. We're only going to know about the ones who accept childcare assistance and have children on those programs because we do have some monitoring regulations as a part of our block grant that we have to go in and do monitoring visits for those programs as well. And then here's a heat map of the exempt programs that are known to us. And so, as I mentioned, the child care assistance and the child care licensing programs are funded through the Child Care Development Block Grant. That is a federal annual block grant that we receive within the Department of Family Services, whose main priority is to serve low-income families and help offset the cost of child care expenses. The total funding amount per year for the block grant and the match requirement and the maintenance of effort requirement is around $19 million, $19 to $20 million per year. Approximately 70% of that is federal funds and approximately 30% of that is general fund and match. We are starting to see an increase in the federal amount being put towards the block grant, so that distribution is going to change a little bit once we get those final figures, but that's what we have for right now. And then when we receive those funds, we have what are called set-asides. So we have particular requirements, spending requirements that we have to meet as a part of that block grant. So we are prescribed about 82% of what the block grant funding goes towards. And you'll see those categories here. We have a 3% set aside for infant and toddler focus, and so that can be training and credentialing to get staff trained to care for infant and toddlers. That can be helping with supplies, many different things that pertain to infant and toddler care, because that is such an expensive, it's a really truly an expensive service to provide. And with the limited number of babies that can be served, there's not much cost benefit there. And so we try to provide as much support possible in that area. Those funds are, right now they go to the University of Wyoming to an entity called the Professional Learning Collaborative. And that's an entity or a program that has 7 facilitators across the state that undertake really rigorous and intensive training for staff within early care and education programs to provide them opportunities on not only infant and toddler training, but research-based, evidence-based training on the education and quality component for early care and education as well. That's a fairly new partnership, and we're really excited to have that across the state. I think it's really elevated early care and education for all of us. Then we have a 9% quality set aside. That funding goes towards paying for our licensors' salaries, as well as some for the Professional Learning Collaborative and for a company called Align that essentially they accredit the training that staff go through and they track that training as well. And then our largest set aside is 70% for direct services or childcare assistance. And so we're required to have 70% of our funds go to childcare assistance for low-income families. In addition to the block grant, which is our predictable revenue source, we also had about $60 million in COVID federal dollars that came directly to the department during the COVID pandemic. We had 3 different funding sources that you can see listed here. Over half of those dollars went directly to early care and education programs. About $32 million went directly to providers to invest in their workforce, their staffing, recruitment, and retention, which you will hear across the state is truly a barrier to providing our total capacity. I think that is a really large pain point for our providers across the state. It paid for overhead costs, it offset tuition for families for a certain amount of time, supplies, mental health services for children and staff, and transportation. We identified these areas of spending through a steering committee that was represented by providers, different state entities, advocacy groups, to be able to really hone in on what would be a good use of these dollars to stabilize the early care and education sector, but also invest long-term in it as well. And so that's why we had some physical space expansion areas, some transportation areas, some mental health areas, to where we could see the investments not only in the short term to help through the pandemic, but also realize those in the long term. I'm happy to report that we did see a 96% retention rate, if you will, for providers. So I think that the stabilization did work. When we ask just kind of casually our licensors on why we might be seeing turnover, or why we see providers no longer provide care, it's a myriad of reasons. It's retirement, it's relocation, it is potentially they had a baby and don't want to provide care anymore. But again, I think the number one thing that we are seeing is it's really hard to get staff into these programs as well. And so we've also invested in the child care assistance program through these federal dollars, both with a rate increase and a change in our payment methodology. And we've heard from providers through an impact study, over 80% of providers have said that that has been a really helpful change. And so we're working really hard within our block grant to be able to sustain those initiatives going forward, not only to help offset the costs for families to afford childcare, but also provide a predictable revenue stream for childcare providers so that they are able to sustain their business and able to provide care for the youngest little ones that we see. Additionally, the last thing about these federal funds is that we'll be embarking on a system modernization to coordinate our services within Department of Family Services, so that families can come and, depending on what their need is, they can search for slot availability in their community, they can search geographically for what their needs are. They can search for the special needs or accommodations if they need them, and they can connect with providers, and they can also connect with childcare assistance if that is a need of theirs as well. And so we have different systems for childcare assistance, for childcare licensing, kind of a one-off for training as well. And we're going to bring all of those systems together to be able to quickly credential staff, quickly onboard them, and then be able to connect families with providers and with services as well. So we're excited to embark on that project, as big as it's going to be. I think it is really going to help our families that we serve. And then my last slide, in addition to all of those other investments that we saw, we also saw access to care increase for youth and for the children in communities through these investments. And so we saw an additional 1,500 children served through the investments that we made in in childcare. And so that means that those are families that were able to go to work, able to go to school and get training, and really help at the community level, not only from an economic standpoint, but from a safety standpoint for these children who are being served in a loving and nurturing environment. So we were excited to see that number. And with that, that is a great segue into workforce development. So Mr. Chairman, I can ask for questions now, or we can keep on going down the workforce development track.
It's a good thing I have long arms. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have, I guess, a couple questions. So for that COVID federal stimulus investment with those 1,500 additional children served, what does that look like once that funding's gone? Are those 1,500 kids kind of out babysitting themselves? What happens without that funding?
Good question. Go ahead, answer.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representative Provenza. We did ask that question when we reviewed the applications for the federal funding. What was your sustainability plan, essentially? And there were a number of different responses. Some were that they wouldn't serve as many children. Some were that they would have to increase tuition to be able to serve that number of children going forward. And you know, those are just kind of your basic economic responses. Some individuals are getting more creative with how they're going to sustain these dollars. But that is really truly where we came in from a department perspective and said, where do we have ways to invest in early care and education, and that is through our block grant. And so as we've kind of taken a deep dive into what our budget looks like through the block grant, again, some additional funding coming in through the block grant, we've said this is how we can help with that sustainability as well, is through an increase in rates and through paying based on enrollment. And so that's kind of our contribution to help offset that also.
Go ahead, follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, so I guess another question, and I think you talk about this potentially later. I'm sure we have kids in gaps, right, where they don't qualify for assistance, but their families can't afford care either, or maybe it's not there. Do you have any guess on what that gap is?
Go ahead, Roxanne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representative Provenza. I don't know that we have data on what that gap is between, you know, our FPL, which is 225%. What we've tried to, what we do with our eligibility is it's on a sliding fee scale. And so we have 6 steps within the child care assistance program. And a family can come in between step 1 and step 4. And so step 1 is your lowest FPL. And then step 4 is around, I'll get you the exact number, about around 150% FPL. And then step 5 and step 6 are transition steps. And so that goes up to 225% FPL. And so we try to transition families off at a higher federal poverty level so that once some of their other benefits, the cliff effect, starts to come in, childcare is the last one for families to no longer be eligible for. And so that's how we help to address that. And then I know that there's many different programs that will offer scholarships and those types of things to help fill in the gap for those families that can't quite make those ends meet because of the affordability factor.
Representative Clausen, you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Roxanne. So on the, I'm just looking at the funding set aside requirements. So we have the 82% that's set aside. What happens with the other 18%? How is that money allocated?
Go ahead, Roxanne.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Representative Clausen. That goes to direct services as well. That goes to child care assistance also. And so that is essentially so that we can serve as many children and families as possible. So anything that is outside of those set asides will go to child care assistance.
Further questions? Go ahead, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, on your slide number 6, you say you have 21,500 total capacity in the licensed. And my questions really are trying to figure out the adequacy of that. Because I do periodically hear some complaints about difficulty in finding childcare. Does that capacity include capacity that is restricted to school children that only need part-time services? Or is this 21,500 the full-time capacity, and mostly in the preschool kids? What's in that number, and what's your sense of the adequacy of childcare? Can people who really need it find it?
Go ahead, Roxanne.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman Scott, for this total capacity, it's based on the child, right? And so it depends on how a program looks at their slot availability. If they have 2 part-time slots, it could count for 2 children. But this is the child number. It's not necessarily based on full-time or part-time slots. This is just kind of your full number. But in regards to your question, I think what you're getting at is, do we have childcare deserts, right? Do we have areas where there's just not enough slots available for the number of children that need care? And the answer is yes, we do. And we have that data that we can provide the committee on, that's by different counties and different locations, where you can see that there's some areas that do have a high childcare desert, that the number of children that need to be served in a childcare facility, they're just not there, right? And then there's some areas where there is adequate slots. I will say that those are also relatively locally based and community based, right? There are some communities where the family friend and neighbor network is strong, right? And that's where we see most children being served, is in those types of programs, which is perfectly adequate for that community. And then there's some where there truly is a childcare gap, and there's difficulty for parents to find programs that will work for them. There's wait lists in many programs that you'll likely hear from some of the providers that are here to speak today. And so I think it's a combination depending on location and different community needs, but we can provide you with the childcare desert information.
And Forenza, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To go back to the assistance of how many kids get tuition, do you know the number of how many children in Wyoming get tuition for that help with that COVID money or childcare money? In terms of funding for able to access, we're looking at that gap, at what might not exist in the future when that money's gone. The number. Sorry, that was word vomit. I got distracted. Okay, I'm going to restate my question. Thank you very much for your patience, everyone. What is the gap in tuition in terms of, we're providing these scholarships or grant funds? What do you know what that number is in terms of, what's the need, the number of kids who need it and the funding available? Do you know?
Go ahead, Roxanne.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Provenza, I'm going to provide you with what I do know, and we'll see if that answers your question. I know the utilization rate for childcare assistance, and that utilization rate in Wyoming is 16%, right? So 16% of families who are eligible, or 16% of families who are on childcare assistance, well, out of the total population that would be eligible for childcare assistance, 16% of families are on childcare assistance. And so that it's a relatively low utilization rate, I will say. So I'm not sure that's exactly what you're looking for, but outside of just knowing the childcare assistance numbers in regards to like private scholarships or these grant dollars, we can look and see what information we have off the top of my head. I don't have it, but we could dig into it more for you.
That work? Okay, anybody else? Go ahead, Senator Beitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question revolves around the idea of having 70% plus of your dollars coming from the federal government. Obviously, there's concerns over the strings that are attached to those monies. Could you provide the committee with, not today, but eventually, what I'm looking for is what the requirements are to maintain your eligibility for these federal funds and what those strings are, so we can decide whether or not, as policymakers, these are funds worth taking, if the juice is worth the squeeze, so to speak. So if you could provide that, that would be excellent.
Mr. Chairman, yes, we can absolutely provide that.
Thank you.
Great. Any other questions? Representatives, I'm sorry, I did it again. Senator Steinmetz, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll answer to both. And that was my question as well. Does this contribute toward our maintenance of effort with the federal government or maintenance of equity? Would these funds then become a part of that requirement? So you may not know that today, but that's a question I would have as well, because that would just increase our level of funding as a state as well if we take the federal funds and it contributes to that. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Steinmetz, the additional dollars that I'm referring to are called discretionary dollars. So we have different buckets, if you will, of funding that come through the block grant. And those dollars don't require a match or a maintenance of effort. And so our match and our MOE won't go up with the additional dollars that are coming in.
Go ahead, Chairman Scott.
Mr. Chairman, if we get concerned about areas where we don't have adequate childcare, the family care homes, which are now required going up to 10 children, what kind of burdens does that licensure requirement put on people getting into and staying in that business? And what would happen if we moved that group to the don't require a license category? Would we increase the availability of childcare, and what would be the consequences of doing that?
Go ahead, Roxanne.
Mr. Chairman, Chairman Scott, I think that's a good question, and that's always a balance that we are looking at in regards to what's the appropriate level of staffing ratios, what's the appropriate level of group size. And so we do research on other states and what those levels look like to try and make sure that we're somewhere in the middle on those. Additionally, we are looking to partner with a company that is going to take a pretty deep dive into our child care licensing rules to look at state's best practices, look at the safety components, look at different ways that we can look at revising our rules to find that balance between health and safety, right? There is absolutely a safety component with our rules, and I think that that's really important to highlight, but also looking at different ways that we might be able to structure our rules so that they are a little bit easier to adhere to, that they're not so prescriptive, and really strike that balance between access, which we know is important for so many different reasons, workforce safety, the list goes on, but also balancing that with the safety within the care that's being provided for those children.
Okay, well, in an effort to get us back on subject, let's go to childcare workforce and continue on, or else we'll be asking you questions all morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Again, Holly Simone, Workforce Program Administrator. I just have a few slides I want to share with you, and wanted to give you some data on childcare workforce and then provide an overview of our Y Quality Counts grant program that we have that assists the early childhood workforce. So the slide you see hopefully up here is childcare workforce. Utilize data from our research and planning team. You can see the average annual wage for childcare workers in Wyoming is around $27,500, which is considerably lower than Wyoming's overall average wage. And that's according to our 2021 wage data and statistics. And I just want to make sure you saw the note that that's the average full-time wage and does not include fringe benefits. So you can see with surrounding states how many folks we have employed as childcare workers and what their average annual wage is there. And this does not include self-employed individuals. So I just wanted to make you aware of that as well. And then next slide, please. This talks about the turnover we're seeing among childcare workers, and that has increased during the pandemic. These are short-term occupational projections, and it shows that negative 0.3 growth rate. And over the next 2 years, Wyoming is projected to have 508 total openings for childcare workers. And part of that is also due to growth, people exiting, and then transfers. And then lastly, on the next slide, just wanted to give you some updates on our Y Quality Counts program. That's a program that administers and awards scholarships, training grants, and then an educational outreach development program. A lot of that is parental education and public awareness as well. And you can see our biennial standard budget for Y Quality Counts is $1.2 million in general funds. And then that's broken out to our scholarships and grants, and then also the program that we administer for that family strengthening, parental education, and public awareness. Over the last 2 years, Y Quality Counts has provided 168 scholarships and 200 grants. And some of those grants are available to those training centers, those early childhood centers, to offset expenses for conferences and trainings. And it's intended to provide that professional development to those owners and their staff. On the scholarship piece, each recipient can be awarded up to $1,000 per state fiscal year, and that helps with their tuition and goes towards either their associate's degree in a child development field or a 4-year college degree as well. And with that, I would take any questions, or I can hand it over to Department of Ed.
Let's go to Department of Ed in the interest of time and keep moving along.
Sounds good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Again, I'm Shelley Hamill. I'm the Chief Academic Officer at the Wyoming Department of Education. Thanks for having me here. So the Wyoming Department of Education engages in the early childhood space in primarily four different ways with an eye always on education. So the first way is through the IDEA, or special education dollars. I'm not going to really talk much about that because Department of Health is going to follow up with that. So the second way is through the receipt of TANF funds that we receive from the Wyoming Department of Family Services. And these are to award to preschool organizations to support the enrollment of eligible children. The third way is that we oversee Title I, Part A federal funds that are distributed to school districts. And allowable use of those funds is for a school district to stand up a preschool if they chose to. And then lastly, the Head Start State Collaboration Office is housed at the WDE. So as noted, the WDE annually receives a small portion of the overall TANF funds that flow into Wyoming. The purpose is to cover the cost of enrollment to high-quality preschools for children coming from low-income families. The WDE runs a competitive grant application process to distribute these funds. And for the current grant cycle, we have 13 different preschool settings that receive those dollars. Those grants run from $45,000 as a low to a high of about $350,000, and it supports the participation of 375 children. So preschools receiving TANF funds must meet certain criteria. They must meet the National Association for Education of Young Children's standards for leadership and management. They must demonstrate the implementation of Wyoming's 2002 early childhood readiness standards. They must ensure that each child that's enrolled through those TANF funds receives a developmental screening, and then they must offer child-centered conferences and coordinate monthly communications in their community or offer an outreach event. The Title I federal funds are similar in purpose to the TANF dollars that I just described, and that the funds should supplement educational programs and services for disadvantaged children in high poverty schools or school areas. So the intent is to ensure that all children have a significant opportunity to receive a fair, equitable, and a high-quality educational experience and to close any perceived gaps. So school districts receive this funding based on the number of children that are at or below the poverty level per the federal government's definition. I think we all understand that there's a direct correlation between poverty and academic achievement. So once the districts receive their allocation, it has the task of identifying which schools within its districts are the highest poverty and will receive the funds. So there are three different categories then. So a school could be determined to not have a high enough poverty rate to receive any of those funds. Or secondly, they could be considered targeted assistance where they have a poverty rate of 35 to 39%, or they could be considered a school-wide designation for Title I-A funds, which means they have a poverty rate of 40% or above. So one allowable use of those Title I Part A funds is to provide preschool opportunities as a way to intervene with children early who are deemed at risk. Preschools identified as targeted assistance will provide those preschool opportunities to children who are identified as at risk of failing to meet academic achievement standards when they reach school age. Whereas schools that are identified as school-wide Title I programs can offer those preschool spots to any child that lives in their school district area. So this school year, there are about 25% of Wyoming school districts that offered preschool programs to their community, and they have reported a total investment of $3.1 million to support those. And then we have the Head Start State Collaboration Office that was moved to the WD about a year ago. The role of this office might be surprising. It certainly was to me when I learned that there was no direct oversight or supervision of our local or Wyoming early Head Start or Head Start programs. Instead, each of these is funded and monitored by the Federal Office of Head Start. The word collaboration, though, in the title, the Head Start State Collaboration Office, is really key. The primary function of this position is to facilitate collaboration and partnerships between entities to better support the needs of low-income families with children whose ages range from birth to 5. The individual in this position is involved in various state initiatives and policy development that focus on improved systems of support for these families and children. There is a strong presence of Head Start in Wyoming, and for the 2023 school year, they're right at 50 Head Start and early Head Start centers scattered across the state, and they serve 1,079 students or children in the Head Start, and they have 363 early Head Start spots. These programs received just over $21 million in federal funding for fiscal year 2022. Of the 13 preschools that I mentioned that receive TANF funds, there are also 4 that receive Head Start funding. So those settings do have the opportunity to apply for those multiple funding sources. So if they are awarded one grant, it doesn't necessarily mean that they won't have the opportunity to be funded with the other.
Go ahead, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hadn't heard of this collaboration office grant before, this potential FTE. So is this something that we've applied for in the past at any point? Is this something that we're looking at? How will this play out?
Mr. Chairman and Senator Rothfuss. So I think that we've had this Head Start Collaborative Office for many years. It was previously placed at Department of Workforce Services. And I think, an effort to align and kind of bring the governance structure together as closely as we could, it was moved over to the Department of Education. It's a small, as you can see, a small amount of money. It's about $125,000 for that position to do that work of collaboration and weigh in on opportunities for partnerships.
Follow-up, Mr. Chairman. So this is technically then a state position, mostly funded by federal funds. I see a 25% match, but it doesn't have authority over Head Start. It's just to facilitate collaboration between Head Start and other programs. Is that accurate?
Mr. Chairman and Senator, that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Do you have a question?
Uh,
Go ahead. Chairman Scott.
Mr. Chairman, on the slide 18, as I read that, about 10% of the TANF money is going to, that's in the block grant, is going to the preschools. When this program started, we could have spent it all on preschools other than what was actually used for the TANF program itself, which we largely did away with. Is that, what's the other 90% of that money used for? And are there now federal restrictions that would preclude us, if we decided to expand preschools, from using that money?
Go ahead, Shelley.
Mr. Chairman, Chairman Scott, that's a great question and one that I don't have an answer to. The Department of Family Services oversees that remaining 90% plus, and they would be better equipped to answer that question.
No, go ahead.
All right, follow up, Senator.
Thank you. Follow up on Chairman Scott's question. In a lot of these programs, we don't necessarily take advantage of all of the aspects of the programs, and that's something I'm not familiar with on TANF. Are there more potential funds available to the state from federal funds through TANF that are possibly available that we're not taking advantage of? And I'll ask the same question, are we fully utilizing resources that are available within the state through Head Start, even though we don't control that? Is that sort of a maximum funding use?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, again, I'm not as familiar with the remainder of the TANF funds. I know that with the TANF funds that are flowed to us, to the WDE, I think that there is a real intent to maximize those funds by looking at other settings that already have funds to really partner and not necessarily braid those dollars, but to get the best bang for the buck. As far as other federal dollars that might be available or an increased amount through TANF or Head Start, I'm not aware of that either. I know with Head Start, those sites, as I mentioned before, they apply directly to the federal office of Head Start for funding. So we really don't have any engagement in that piece.
Go ahead, Senator Rothfuss.
Could more sites apply for federal Head Start funds and be eligible? Is it a fixed pie for the state? Or if 25% more sites applied, would there be the potential for 25% more Head Start students in the state?
Good question.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, I would have to check on that. I mean, I have a gut check, but I don't want to put it out there until I am accurate. So I can find that out.
Are we close? Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, on the TANF funding, where that was coming from was a reward for reducing the welfare rolls in the old AFDC as opposed to the TANF program. And we have pretty much got the maximum that we can out of that. So the federal funds can't increase. We could be forced to use some of them for direct welfare payments. If our program change, but it hasn't. It has been remarkably stable over the years. So we could spend more of the 18 million on preschools, and I would suggest to the committee, if we ultimately decide that's the way to go, there's your funding source.
Go ahead, Senator Roth.
And I think Roxanne wanted to weigh in also on that TANF funding availability, so if we could check with her too.
That's
Excellent.
why I said anybody.
Anybody.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss. Yes, so our TANF grant falls under our Economic Security Division, so a different division. So we'll get you more detailed information than what I can provide. But the TANF grant is a block grant, and it is fully obligated to many different programs. Public health nursing for home visitation, some community-based programs. I mean, there's a lot of different programs that TANF funds across the state. It is fully obligated, and so if we were to look at additional investments in preschools, there would then be decisions made on where that funding is at right now and where it shifts from to then provide more TANF funding to preschools.
So I think we're interested in what the TANF dollars are being spent on. So can you get us that
Mr. Chairman, yes, we can get you that.
Mr. Chairman. And what would change that number? I'm guessing it would just be a population change, would probably change the amount of funds available, but are there any other provisions that go into that calculation that would be within our control? You may know now, but if not, if you could follow up.
Mr. Chairman, yes, there's different criteria that it's based on the number of children at a certain age level in which we get funded for the block grant. And we'll provide that funding formula for you as well in our follow-up. And then we can provide any additional information that we have regarding requirements or opportunities for TANF.
Shelley, were you close to being through with your part, or do you want to continue on? Or would you like to continue on?
I am finished. If there are no other questions, thank you. And I'll pass over to Mr. Petrie.
Thank you. The floor is yours, Matt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, my name is Matt Petrie. I'm the Senior Administrator of the Behavioral Health Division for the Department of Health. One of the four major programs in my division is the Early Intervention and Education Program. We refer to it as Part C and Part B. It serves children birth through age 5, and we obviously have those children broken down into 2 age categories. The Early Intervention and Education Program, or EIEP as we call it, it oversees programs, again, for children that are identified to have developmental delays. Just for clarification, Part B is federally mandated. It serves children from their 3rd birthday through age 5. Really, it serves them to the point where they enter kindergarten. We say through age 5, but in some cases we have children that are older than that entering kindergarten. Part C, on the other hand, is a program that serves children birth through age 2. It is not federally mandated. It is a state option. Every state in the union has opted in to provide Part C services to children. You can see from the slide that we have before you right now, Part C is that program that provides early intervention services to those children birth through age 2. They then, in some cases, children do not need to advance from Part C to Part B. They have their services or their needs have been addressed through services, and they're able to essentially exit the program. Most of the students, I think, that are in Part C will eventually move into Part B. And again, this provides special education and related services for eligible students age 3 to 5 years, through 5 years. I think an important distinction, and you'll see it on this screen, is that those children served in Part C, again, birth through age 2, we refer to as children. It is really it is a family based program. When we get into Part B, which serves those children aged 3 through 5, we refer to those children as students. A very important distinction, and I think that Shelley may have touched on it previously, but Part B services are governed by IDEA, and IDEA really covers all children, birth through or 3 through age 21. Here you see the acronym IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Again, it requires states to provide what we call FAPE, or free appropriate public education, and that includes special education and related services, again, to students or children ages 3 through 21 with disabilities. The state has the option to provide services for children younger than that, and again, that is the Part C portion of the program that I mentioned previously. The state of Wyoming has opted into that. The state education agency is the Wyoming Department of Education, and so our portion of the program that serves children 3 through 5 is governed by the Department of Education largely. We are considered, in some instances, we are considered the 49th school district. We are what's known as a local education agency, and actually you will hear your 48 traditional K-12 districts referred to as LEAs as well. So in some respects, we are considered the local education agency. The funding for the Part B program, really two sources of funding, and you'll see this in a little bit more detail in a subsequent slide. There is federal funding, of course, because it is a federally mandated program. That funding, like it does for the 48 traditional K-12 districts, goes to the Department of Education and then is passed through education to us in the Department of Health. If you look at our budget document, it's a little misleading because you will actually see those funds under the other funds category because it is a pass-through rather than a direct grant from the U.S. Department of Education to the Department of Health. When we start talking about the Part C program, again, there's both a federal funding aspect to it and a state funding aspect to it. The only difference in terms of operation is that we apply for those grants, specifically the Department of Health does, and those grants come to us directly. They do not flow through the Department of Education. And as you'll see in some of the subsequent slides, Department of Education's oversight and involvement is greater, quite frankly, in the Part B program, just because they do have responsibility for IDEA in the state of Wyoming, and so that covers our 3 to 5 year population. The screenshot that you see in front of you right now just gives you a bit of a flow chart where we try to simplify really what I just described. Again, IDEA applies to all children birth through age 21 and requires supports for children with disabilities, again, regardless of whether they're children served by our programs or they're served by the Department of Education. Again, you can see there the reference to the Department of Education as the state education agency. And then through the Department of Education, it delegates that service provision to local education agencies. Again, those are all 48 of your traditional K-12 districts, and then the EIEP program administered by my division. EIEP Part C services, again, primarily intervention services, primarily provided to families within the home. These are parents of children that have been identified as having developmental delays, developmental disabilities. And so those services, again, are primarily provided in the home, but in some cases in daycare settings as well. Part B 619, more of an instructional, more of an educational perspective to it, serve children ages 3 to 5 years. The delivery of the services, whether we're talking about Part B or Part C, is through contracted community or children development centers, childhood development centers. And What we do is we have an application process for entities to basically apply to provide these services. In Wyoming, we have 14 CDCs, if you will. Those CDCs carry out both Part C and Part B services. They're required to provide both. That's a requirement for application. They must also serve what we call their entire region, and we'll see a map in a subsequent slide that depicts the regions that they serve. This is the map that I just referred to. So we have a total of 14 CDCs that we contract with. They are not limited to operating strictly out of their main facilities. We have a total, across the 14 of them, we have 42 locations across the state of Wyoming in every county. The interesting thing about this map, from my perspective, is you can see that the CDCs don't just cover counties. They don't just cover a specific school district. What you really see here, and I think if you look in the northwest corner of the state, you can see that we have one region that covers 4 counties, and within those 4 counties are 10 school districts, 10 traditional school districts. So you have a very wide-ranging capacity of services, not only geographically, but in terms of population. The way that we fund these child development centers is what we call a per child count. What we do is we look at, on an annual basis, December 1st of each year, we take a snapshot in time. We look at the number of children that the CDCs are serving in both the Part C environment, again, for those children birth through age 2, and in the Part B environment, 3 through 5. We take that per child amount and we multiply it by a funding amount that's statutorily defined. And that gives us essentially the funding that we need for the programs. You can see, again, we do that per child amount. That point in time count occurs on December 1st of each year. The most recent child count for the Part C program was 1,161 children that were served as of December 1st of last year. And then the children, the eligibility criteria that children, and in Part C really, the eligibility criteria for participation for children and families is defined in Chapter 8 rules of the Department of Health. I won't go through all of the services provided by Part C providers. You can see them for yourself. They include social emotional development activities. The very last bullet there, I think, is very informative. You can see that there are a great number of services provided, really a wide scope of services, including a number of therapies. I think that's very important. Therapists in the state of Wyoming are, especially today, hard to find and expensive if you can find them. Just an overview of the Part B program. Again, funding is really determined the exact same way. There is a dollar amount, a minimum dollar amount set in statute for funding of children in the EIEP program. The legislature can choose to fund them at a higher level than that, but there is a base amount that must be funded. The funding model itself works the same way. On December 1st, we take a snapshot. We look at the number of children being served in the Part B program. We multiply those children, the number of those children, by that dollar amount, and that comes up with the amount that we need for funding. As of December 1st of this last year, that count was at 2,387 students. In terms of eligibility criteria, the eligibility criteria for children being served in Part C, again, is governed by Department of Health rules, Chapter 8. Those children being served in Part B, children 3 through 5, that is governed, the eligibility requirements are governed by WDE rules in their Chapter 7. Again, I won't read to you the services summary. There are certainly some similarities between both Part C and Part B. Just keep in mind that the focus of Part C, there is a greater focus on provision of services to family members, not just the children, but also the family members. In Part B, I think it shifts a little bit more heavily toward the student side and to those kids, ages 3 through 5. Again, last bullet point on this screenshot, very extensive list of services that the CDCs must provide to these children. If they do not have in-house staff to provide these services, which is the case often for therapies, they must contract for those services independently. This line chart really just gives you an idea of the enrollment over a period of time. The thing that you'll see, the bottom line on this line chart or this line graph is Part C. You can see that the number of children served in Part C is roughly half of the number of children served in Part B. The student count is relatively flat, relatively consistent for Part C. The reason for that is these services must be provided year-round, 12 months a year. So you really do not see any peaks and valleys in enrollment. The line on the top part of the graph reflects Part B, and you do see peaks and valleys. Those peaks and valleys are due to the fact that Part B services follow more of a traditional school district semester type of pattern. So what you'll see is children receive services in Part B 9 months out of the year. During the summer, they do not receive services. So you see those valleys during the summer months. The screen that you have before you now really just breaks down at a very high level the program expenditures and the number of children served. Again, we've talked about the number of children served. You can see for the various state fiscal years there, not a great deal of variation either in Part C or in Part B. You can see, I think the telling thing on this screen is the total cost of the program. Whether we're talking about Part C or Part B, you can see the total cost of the program, the vast majority of it is funded with state money, state general fund money. Federal dollars make up the difference. Keep in mind that the child development centers that we contract with for delivery of these services are nonprofit entities. So they can take charitable donations, and they do take charitable donations. But I think that the range of funding that they receive from charitable donations varies greatly from one CDC to another. But again, I think the important thing from this screen is to see that the student counts are relatively consistent, but that the funding is very heavily comes from the state. The only other thing that I might add to that screen that I think it's an important difference, I had mentioned earlier that the Behavioral Health Division, the EIEP program, and the CDCs that we contract with to deliver those services are considered the 49th school district, especially when we're talking about Part B services. An important distinction, though, is obviously we've talked about the funding model. The funding model for the CDCs differs greatly from that for the 48 other school districts. The other, I think, other important distinction is keep in mind that the CDCs are nonprofits. They must pay for their buildings. They must pay for the maintenance of their buildings, their utilities, their insurance, their staff, their software, hardware, pretty much all of their expenditures. So in that respect, it does differ from K-12 districts. The other thing that I think is important to know, and most of you having just come through the session will understand this, but every year we're required by statute to make 2 exception budget requests. One is it's called an external cost adjustment for the CDCs. It's not the same as the one for the K-12 districts, though it uses some of the same factors, not as many factors, but some of the same factors. And so what we do is on an annual basis, the Department of Education provides us with that external cost adjustment factor. We then come to the legislature and ask for an additional appropriation. to cover those inflationary increases. The kicker about the external cost adjustment is that it runs cumulatively. So we keep track of how much money we've asked for to cover inflationary increases over time. And then if the legislature appropriates some money against that ask, we subtract that off. Historically, for probably the last 7 years, there were no ECAs granted, with the exception of the last 2 years. Last year, we received about $1.9 million against an ask of roughly $9 million. That was the accumulated external cost adjustment, was that $9 million. We received about 1.9 million of it, which represented 1 year's worth of inflationary cost increases. This past year, the legislature appropriated an additional $4 million against what at that time was an $11 million ask. So just to keep in mind that, again, we're required to ask for that funding every year. We do so, but our ask is based upon a cumulative amount of unfunded external cost adjustments. The other exception request we're required to make on an annual basis is for the child count. If that December 1st snapshot that we take indicates that we're serving more children than we were in the previous year, then we ask for funding for those children. With that, Mr. Chairman, that concludes my presentation. I'd be glad to stand for questions.
All right, we'll ask for questions. Go ahead. No, I got Representative Brown on the end.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for all of this information. I think it's very, very pertinent. A lot of us on this committee have heard this before, but there's also a lot of people on this committee that have not heard this discussion before. So I'm going to ask probably 2, maybe 3 questions. Number one, the biggest question that I have is, I know the answer to this, but I'd like everybody else to know the answer to this as well, is how many states utilize Part B and C inside their Department of Health as opposed to their Department of Education?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, I don't know the exact number, though I can tell you that it is the number of EIEP programs that are administered by departments of education is much greater. It's probably, if I had to guess, I'd say less than 10 states in the country where EIEP resides in the Department of Health. The bulk of them certainly have it in their Department of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple follow-ups, if I could.
Go ahead.
With your
floor is yours.
Thank you. Matt, on this, what I guess I'm trying to get to a little bit differently is this has to do with the education portion. I understand the health component, but this is really about education. And so when we look at this as a policy discussion, it's housed within you guys. So does this make it a more cumbersome process to house this program within 2 different departments that have to interact with each other? Or as we get ready to see policy recommendations, would this be a fair statement to say that because the majority of what we're dealing with here is IDEA, that this would fall more appropriately underneath the Department of Education on a regular basis for Part B and Part C?
Go ahead, Matt.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, I think it could go either way. I think that you can see from the slide presentation that there is certainly a medical and behavioral aspect to the services provided. I wouldn't disagree that in the 3 to 5 age category, that it is more heavily weighted on the instructional side. In the Part C program, again, an optional program opted in by every state, I think I wouldn't say it's more medical, but I would say it's more family-based, based upon a medical diagnosis that allows that family to be served under Part C. I think there's some real value in having Part C and Part B administered by the same agency, regardless of whether it were the Department of Health or the Department of Education, because it minimizes the transition for those students that are in C that still require services and move into B.
Last one, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for that. That's exactly what I was trying to get to, is that ease of transition. The last thing that I would say on this is this has been a fan favorite of me Honestly, I've carried this bill, and I think Senator Rothfuss has also carried this bill at least 2 times apiece to try to make this transition more appropriate to the Department of Education. But when we talk about this, I want to make sure that I understand this and that the whole committee understands this, that this is not just a free-for-all, right? This is a medical diagnosis. This is a clear and concise understanding that there is needs of a student. This is not just somebody who wants to come in and grab preschool dollars at your local CDC and they can just waltz in and get childcare. This has a true benefit to these individuals that have either a medical diagnosis or a learning disability that has been found, and that they go through a rigorous process to understand that, right? So although this is a policy decision, there's also the understanding that if we don't provide the funding, as you mentioned, a lax of $7 million last year, what we start to see is these kids do not then have that ability to progress prior to entering into the K-12 system, and then are basically behind the 8 ball, if you will, walking into the K through 12 system. Am I framing that correctly in the way that you would look at that?
Go ahead, Matt.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, yes, absolutely. I think that the services provided by both Part C and Part B are essential to the larger educational system, because you've identified those developmental delays at the earliest possible point. And the rules governing eligibility for Part C and Part B are very rigid. I mean, those families and those children that are identified for services truly need those. Being able to address those at the earliest possible age, I think is beneficial, obviously not just for the students and the families, but for the community as a whole. So I think that, again, incredibly important, very, very beneficial to everyone involved. I'm not sure I fully answered your question, but I think that the program itself is incredibly important to those children and those families.
Chairman Scott has some questions.
Mr. Chairman, on the number of children served, I think it was your slide 31 and reference we've got. My question is, what % of the children that the experts think are out there that would qualify are we serving? And am I right in thinking historically I've known we have served a much higher percentage of those children in Wyoming than other states have? Is that still true, and do we know what that percentage is?
Go ahead, Matt.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, I do not have the answer to that question, though I think that we can certainly provide it. I will tell you that I think that given the number of ways that children can be identified as having developmental delays, does a very good job of identifying those children and making those services available to them. Probably the largest percentage of children that are identified are in need of speech language pathology services and occupational service, or excuse me, speech therapist services. But all children must also be screened for other developmental delays. And so those that are identified as having 1 or 2 needs are identified as such, but children are also screened for other developmental delays, and those children are identified with those more complex needs.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, a few years ago, the Appropriations Committee discovered we were identifying a much higher percentage of our population as needing these services than many other states, and tried to cut the program back accordingly. And we did investigate that. And at that time, we found we were not serving more than was there. We were serving a relatively high percentage of what was there. And what I'm trying to do is figure out if that's still true. I suspect it is, but I don't know that.
Okay. You'll find that out for us. So.
Mr. Chairman, we will, yes.
Thank you. Go ahead, Shelley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to add a couple of pieces of clarifying information to Mr. Petrie's testimony. There are 13 disability categories that are available for a student to be identified through with the federal government. And developmental disability is one of those. So a child that is already part of the Part C, which is more of a medical model, is that appropriate to say, would be looked at mostly through the lens of medical need. But when they turn 3, then they become a child, they have to be reevaluated, and there is a comprehensive evaluation that occurs to look at all areas that are suspected that there might be a disability. So it is very thorough and should be. And so I think we have historically seen higher numbers at the CDC area in the area of speech language, and we would hope to see those drop off as they enter the school system, because we would hope that early intervention would be meeting their needs and that we would see that change. But I think we can work together to find those current numbers. But I just wanted to make sure that you all understood that it was a very thorough process, and that there are 13 different categories that a child might be able to be identified in as a student with a disability in need of educational support. And then I also wanted to just clarify that the CDCs do keep their doors open during the summer because they're providing those services to Part C, but there are many children, students, age 3 to 5, whose IEPs might identify services for summer as well. So I wanted to make sure that you all knew that that could occur year-round as well. Thank you.
Go ahead, Representative Lawley.
Thank you so much for the information that you provided. And as a grandparent of someone child who's been through all of these services, it is a fantastically important program for developmentally delayed children. One of the things, though, that I've noticed is sometimes there's a parent hesitancy, which is, of course, their right to not enter these programs. But what do you do? What currently programs are there available to help parents better understand what these services are and how you work together for the benefit of those developmental delayed children?
Anybody.
Okay, Mr. Chairman and Representative Lawley, there is a parent information center that is supportive. There are also different advocacy groups that a parent could find an advocate, but we would hope that both the staff at the CDCs and our school district staff are well informed and can help educate parents as to what their rights are and what services are available to meet the needs of their child that's been identified for those services. We would certainly encourage any parent that has, we do a large campaign called Child Find, because that's an obligation through IDEA to identify any child that is potentially has a disability and then do a thorough evaluation to determine if they do qualify for services. We'd encourage any parent to reach out either to their school district or to their local CDC to make connection. Mm-hmm.
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Go ahead, sir.
In addition to that Child Find activity that Shelley just described, obviously, there are also diagnoses from primary care physicians, those in the medical field that basically refer parents to these services. And the CDCs also work with private preschools, private daycares to help them identify those children that may be placed in their care that are in need of these types of services as well.
Representative Clausen, your question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just, I think Ms. Hamel, you had mentioned 25 of our school districts have early Head Start programs. I guess my question, though, really, whatever that number is why would the other districts not have early Head Start programs?
So, Mr. Chairman and Representative Clausen, so I said that 25%, so 12, I think the count is 11 or 12, school districts offer a preschool program funded with Title I funds, not TANF dollars. There is one school district that offers that preschool that does receive TANF dollars in conjunction with utilizing their Title I-A funds. I think it's also relevant to say that there are portions of the IDEA funds that school districts receive that they can flow into those preschool setting as well for early intervention services. But I can't really speak to why a school district would or wouldn't. they would be better poised to answer that question. But it could be based on community services and if they feel like those are already being met. But that would be a great question for them.
Further questions? All right, we'll take public comment as we go. Oh, we got one more is right. I'm sorry. I'm trying to move this along.
Mr. Chairman, I will be brief. I think it demonstrates with all of us sitting at the table how complex Wyoming's early education system is. And so I promise to just today highlight some of the key areas that the governor's office, in collaboration with the statewide Early Childhood Advisory Council, as well as our agencies, have been working on over the past 4 years. I hope that some of these items may help inform you as you consider policy recommendations moving forward. I will offer to come back at a later date and provide you more details on any of them. There are some reports, as Representative Brown pointed out, that we have developed over the last 4 years as a result of some of these conversations. So in 2019, Wyoming ranked 49th for efficiency for early childhood governance. And shortly after Governor Gordon took office, he recognized how critical a strong start to a child's educational journey is in helping them finish strong in their education and their future, and how fragmented our early childhood system is at the state level. He seized the opportunity at the time to apply for the Federal Preschool Development Grant, Birth Through 5, often referred to as PDG B through 5. And the grant was passed with bipartisan support and is focused on state system building, so just what we're talking about here today. Almost every state in the country now has received 2 rounds, at least 2 rounds. And I want to just say that the John P.L. Bogan Foundation funded a grant writer to support the state's initial effort to the application development and the submission process in 2019, when Wyoming was successful in getting $2 million to conduct a needs assessment and write Wyoming's first strategic plan for early childhood. And then in 2021, the state applied for and was awarded an additional $3 million for an extension grant for the next 3 years. And we are currently in the last year of the extension grant, which will end in December of 2023. And all of the grant information and the accomplishments of the grant can be found on the Wyoming Quality Counts website that you heard referred from the Department of Workforce Services earlier today. One of the big successes of the grant that I'll point out was the development of the early learning standards, birth through kindergarten. And the effort to establish the standards was led by the University of Wyoming's Early Childhood Outreach Network. The standards map the development across the transition to kindergarten and are designed to assist and support children in their development. Another key area tied to the standards that has been addressed through the work of the grant is the development of a draft definition for kindergarten readiness. Wyoming has not historically had a definition, and numerous benefits include creating shared expectations among staff in schools and families, informing teaching practices, and supporting measurement of readiness to allocate resources if readiness is not desired are some of the benefits. The draft definition is now out for communities to provide input and feedback. Wyoming also has historically not made a decision to collect statewide data on kindergarten readiness, and currently there is no statewide assessment for kindergarten readiness, which many states have. Districts evaluate and collect data at the local level, but there's not a collection at the state level. And I know the Department of Education is going to discuss this topic in greater detail with all of you in the next portion of the agenda. So I am going to leave it to them to add more details on this topic. On the next slide, I'd like to share with you some data that demonstrates how critical the early years are to students, families, and the school district's success. Wyoming's third grade test scores are incredibly predictive of high school outcomes. In most states, there are a lot of districts where students are losing a lot of ground every year. Thankfully, that's not the case in Wyoming. Our schools are doing an impressive job of keeping students on pace. This graph shows the levels of student growth produced by school districts in Wyoming, and you will notice nearly 90% of our districts produce between 0.95 and 1.1 years of growth in an academic year, compared to 30% across the nation. And the two districts with the lowest growth rate are the districts with high overall achievement, which makes it difficult to produce high growth rates. In other words, what that means is that a cohort of children that are on track in third grade are extremely likely to finish high school. But it also means that children that are a year behind at the end of second grade likely will not be caught up by the end of high school. That highlights how incredibly important it is to have our students on track by third grade. I want to apologize on this next slide. The subjects are reversed. So if you look at the data, English language arts should be at the top and math at the bottom. It got changed in translation. But what's most important about this slide, and really what I wanted to point out, is that third grade data has been largely consistent from 2013 to 2014, third grade data has been largely, since 2013, 2014. The percentage of students proficient and advanced in math has been between 49 and 53%, and the percentage of students proficient and advanced in ELA has been between 50 and 61%. So if these current trends hold, these should be expected to hold, but to see meaningful improvements, the state will need to focus on the years prior to third grade. I mentioned earlier when Wyoming applied for the PDG grant in 2019, we were ranked 49th for efficiency of early childhood governance. Unfortunately, today, Wyoming is now ranked 50th in the nation because the only state behind us made meaningful improvements, and that is Texas. In 2020, a task force was appointed with broad representation from across the state to make recommendations to approve Wyoming's early childhood governance structure, including appropriate roles for both state government and community leaders. The recommendations, sorry, I need to go to the next slide. The recommendations of the task force included moving Wyoming quality counts from the Department of Workforce Services to the Department of Family Services, increasing the Department of Family Services leadership role in home visiting and having it develop an overall plan for home visiting in the state, consolidating what we just spoke about, IDA functions at the Department of Education, including both Part B and Part C, and moving the Head Start Collaboration Office to WDE. That change actually did occur a couple years ago through the budgetary process. A draft bill including these proposed changes were presented to this committee in 2020. However, the changes were not adopted. Among some of the reasons expressed at that time was the need to better understand the details behind the transition, as well as concerns expressed regarding differences in funding between the school districts and the child development centers. Since that time, the executive branch, through the grant, has been committed to trying to address these concerns. We now have a transition report with proposals to consider what would enact the transition for a governance change, as well as an analysis and recommendations on how to improve, as Senator Scott suggested, special education evaluation and how early childhood special education is financed. So some next steps that you could consider is to discuss the task force recommendations and the report, as well as the recent recommendations related to the evaluation and finance for special education. And again, these are all very complex topics and would be happy to come back with you on those findings and those reports at a later date. Beyond what I have described to you, the grant has had many other successes that I won't go through in great detail here, but just quickly, two of them that I want to mention is that the agencies through MOUs are now sharing data through an early childhood integrated data system. Today, you've all raised great questions regarding data. And without that, it is hard to make decisions or data-driven decisions without that. So this system will now have the ability beginning this year to pull data from all of the agencies to begin that data-driven decision-making. The other item here is a kindergarten transition toolkit that was also developed by the grant and by the statewide Early Childhood Advisory Council. And that is now being reviewed by our community partners. And later this year, it will be available for communities to begin using to strengthen the transitions to kindergarten. Lastly, I'd just like to emphasize the 3 key items that could be impactful in improving Wyoming's early childhood system. Wyoming's preschool development grant, Birth to 5, has examined some of the key elements of the state's early childhood system. Based on the work, there are a number of steps that we could take. Wyoming's K-12 system, as mentioned earlier, has shown that it can keep students progressing steadily from 3rd grade through 12th grade. When it comes to keeping children on track in those years, the state's data is far better than the national data. But there are very few districts in the United States that can get a cohort of children caught up if that cohort is even a year behind as of 2nd grade. And unfortunately, many children in Wyoming are in fact already behind early in their academic careers. Rethinking the state's early childhood system offers an opportunity to positively impact child outcomes at a developmentally appropriate time. Expanding access to services is important. Wyoming is one of 6 states that does not offer state-funded preschool services. As you heard earlier, some school districts are offering pre-K on their own using Title I or TANF funds, but providing support for expanded access to preschool would help children get off to a better academic start. And as mentioned earlier, the state is using the grant to develop an early childhood integrated data system, which would allow the state to identify the areas with the greatest needs on defined criteria, such as we discussed earlier, income levels. The integrated data system would also improve the state's ability to track the impact of its investments over time and adjust its course if needed. As in most states, Wyoming could adopt what's referred to as a mixed delivery approach to preschool that allows both schools and private providers to offer services, which supports family choice and increases the odds that children will be in the kind of setting their parents want. Investment in preschool should build on the state's primary education investment in the early years, support for children with special needs under IDEA, as pointed out earlier. A work group of representatives from the school districts and the CDCs have been working together, as I suggested earlier, on recommendations for improving how these funds can be leveraged to support our young children. Next, expanding support for families and communities. Even in small communities, parents can face a bewildering set of options for children. And Representative Lawley raised the point that where do parents go to discover what opportunities and programs exist? Some communities have focused on providing supports to parents to help them navigate those available options. State support for community level capacity to help parents find the right setting for their children, whether or not that setting is publicly funded, could help families at a sensitive and difficult time and lead to better outcomes for children. Whether children are in pre-kindergarten education and care settings or not, the transition into kindergarten is an important time. Wyoming's Early Childhood State Advisory Council has developed the toolkit that I mentioned for communities to support improved kindergarten transition. If the state provided support to schools and communities, that could help providers work together more efficiently and effectively on behalf of families. And lastly, improving the efficiency of the state's oversight, as I briefly discussed earlier. What early child programs Wyoming has are fragmented and spread across multiple agencies. In 2020, the task force recommended consolidating governance functions in the Department of Education and Department of Family Services. At the time, the recommendations, as I said, did not move forward, largely because of the concerns from CDCs about how they would be impacted by the change. But we have a new opportunity, and with a new superintendent, if governance changes were packaged with changes to IDEA funding and evaluation oversight, ones that CDCs have been actively involved in development, that could substantially change that dynamic. If the overall package of reforms is seen as benefiting the CDCs, a change in governance would be much more feasible, and the grant work has been designed to make that possible. As a package, These reforms would, number one, expand the number of children receiving early childhood services. 2, improve services for children who would already have been eligible for services under IDA. 3, focus resources on the children and communities most in need. 4, help support parents to find the right setting for their children. 5, help support schools and providers to work together on behalf of parents. And lastly, help the state be more effective at overseeing the programs it supports. And Mr. Chairman, with that, that concludes our presentation.
Good job. Thank you. Questions? A myriad of questions, right? Go ahead, Chairman.
Chairman. Not a question, but a comment. Mr. Chairman, for past 30 years, there've been periodic efforts to switch the child development programs which deal with the kids with disabilities to Department of Education, and we have successfully resisted those. And let me make it very clear that I intend to continue to resist that, because the figures I've seen are that we do a much better job in dealing with the special education needs in the preschool years with our current system. Other states that have switched, tend to be the school districts wind up responsible for that. And they do not do as good a job. They aren't as good at getting all the kids in. They do not tend to do the instruction, do the services in an age-appropriate manner. And we have done a much better job of controlling our special education expenses with getting the kids treated with our current system. And I'm afraid we would eventually lose that. And so I wanted to make that very clear. I think there is some real possibility in improving the K-3 reading results by expanding the preschool offerings. And if we do, and that's a different issue than the CDCs, which are really related to the special education needs, Mr. Chairman. And I would suggest we ought to look at that as a committee as something, and potentially the TANF funds are a source of funding for that, Mr. Chairman, because that becomes a matter of setting some priorities. But I'm sick and tired of the organizational fighting on this one.
Questions? Go ahead, Representative Berger.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. Again, I guess this is for the governor or the governor's office, and based off of what you talked about as far as what we're improving that pre to third grade or kindergarten to third grade, has the governor, and I've asked this question already, but has the governor looked at, or have you guys looked at changing the compulsory attendance laws or statutes if we're going to put a lot of money into that K-3 group? Has the governor brought that up?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Berger, no, we have not looked at compulsory attendance as part of this discussion. But thank you.
Okay. Other questions? If there's no other questions, we'll go to public comment, and then we'll come back to policy after lunch. So we'll move to public comment.
And Mr. Chairman, just so you're aware, Speaker Summers is online and would like to comment. Back.
All righty. Well, let's start there, and maybe that'll spur some more people up for public comment. Speaker Summers, welcome.
Mr. Chairman, committee members, thank you. Can you guys hear me okay?
No, we got a bad connection.
All right. Can you hear me better now?
Better.
Better, but not good. So go to somebody else and I'll put some headphones.
No, lost it.
You said go to somebody else and I'll work on it.
Okay. Anybody else? Please come forward. come forward and have a seat, and when Speaker Summers gets his comments, gets his technology caught up. Please state your name and.
Okay, hello, I'm Alicia Roan. I'm the Executive Director of the Child Development Center in Natrona County. And with me today, I have two of my board members, Robin Landon, which I'm sure many of you know, as well as Shannon Orr, who founded the Orr's Hope Foundation in Wyoming. I just wanted to touch base on this topic as I have been one of the many in opposition of our programs moving from the Department of Health to the Department of Education, simply because there wasn't a plan in place. And I felt as though it was bad business to have the discussion without a plan in place in moving these programs that have been in existence for over 50 years serving children. The child development centers do not belong under our school districts. They belong under an early childhood office. And I think it poses the question of what does that look like? And where should that office be housed to include, TANF, childcare licensing, et cetera, just under one umbrella. And I think it bears weight to have all of us come to the table and have that discussion, which I was glad to see that Superintendent Dagenfelder put it as one of her strategic plan items. And I, as well as other CDC directors, are thankful to be part of that cabinet and have that conversation on what that might look like. Also, my program is a TANF site. It does receive Wyoming Quality Counts scholarship. We are DFS certified. We provide Part B and Part C, and we serve over 600 children per month and also deliver 1,200 development screenings. We are identifying children in Wyoming across all 14 regions. In fact, at the 2020 legislation, I brought forward a piece that showed Wyoming is actually #1 in the United States for identifying children with special needs, and we're doing a great job. So I guess in twofold, we need to look at, perhaps what would an early childhood office entail? It has to include Part B and Part C. We can't have Part C in one department and Part B in another department because that causes an unfair transition for families. So who's best to house that? And I don't know that if it's Department of Education. I don't know if it's Department of Family Services or Department of Health, but I think it begs the question to have this cabinet that Superintendent Dagenfelder formed to discuss a plan in moving forward that's best for Wyoming's children. And another piece, which Ms. Brandt brought up, is the finance component. I sat on one of the committees, and I was thankful for that in looking at what child development centers receive per child in comparison to what the school districts receive per child. And for the 3 to 5-year-olds, IDEA, we have the same requirements as school districts to serve these children with special needs. So on average, the school districts receive about $19,000 per child to serve them. We receive $8,640 per child, even though in state statute, it says that child development centers should be compensated the same as school districts, and we're not. That $8,640 has to cover preschool, speech, OT, PT, transportation, our buildings. What school districts have is different pots of funding. We don't. And we are barely surviving. With all of the compliance that has been put upon us by IDEA and serving these children with special needs, I am concerned of the CDCs that are going to be viable for the future if we don't create change at the state level and fund these programs appropriately. I think we can do better. I think we're on our way. I'm glad to have this conversation again, as Senator Rothfuss and Representative Brown have been a huge part of it in the past. But again, we just need to come up with a healthy plan for all. Thank you for your time.
Anybody have questions for Michelle?
Alicia, but that's okay.
I wrote it
I
down.
can call
I wrote it
Alicia,
down, Alicia.
but thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Please go ahead. Well, let's see if Speaker Summers, how's your connection now, Speaker Summers?
Mr. Chairman, can you hear me with the headphone on?
Yes, can we get it any louder from our end, on our end?
Yeah, I can speak louder if that
That helped.
works. Okay. So, Mr. Chairman, can you hear me okay or not? All right,
good.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. You know, I've been thinking long and hard about the issue of early childhood funding and some of the other funding, I guess, wishes that we have in the legislature. And so there is a desire to provide additional funding for early childhood programs, and there's a desire to fund school of choice for K-12 students. Both are interim topics. My idea is to create an education savings account program that provides funding to parents for those children that are 200% of federal poverty level or less, which is a $60,000 income for a family of 4. Children 3 years of age through 12th grade would be eligible for an ESA. 2 pots of money, one for early childhood, one for K-12, would be created and funded out of general fund. Program limited by appropriation with limited money, the program would fund the poorest child first. And so how do you make this program constitutional? And I think that's just it. And that is that you look at those students that are that are poor, right? I mean, based upon Article 16, Section 6 AI of the Wyoming Constitution, public money can't be spent on individuals except for the necessary support of the poor. K-12 students would be required to take the state summative test, which would help the constitutional question of adequacy. And be reported, but nothing would be required of that. So I guess, long story short, I'm working with Tanya to draft a bill on this concept. I think it's a way to solve a couple of problems and find some cooperation between it. I guess it's a way to solve a couple of different problems with one vehicle. And so, Mr. Chairman, I don't know how much of that you heard, but that's kind of what I'm working on. When I get it done, I will present it to the chairman for their consideration to bring to the committee. So I'd stand for any questions.
Is there questions for Speaker Summers? Thank you, Albert. Chairman Scott, do you have a question?
Mr. Chairman, my thinking is that what you're suggesting fits well within the charge that this committee has from the Management Council on school choice. Is that a correct understanding of what the Management Council did?
So, Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
So, Mr. Chairman, this would be within what Management Council provided to this committee to work on. And my idea kind of kills 2 birds with 1 stone, so to speak. It's obviously, this is just a piece of the puzzle for funding early childhood, but it would allow a family to carry money to an early childhood program, which will help benefit, I think, another set of parents out there.
Very good. We're looking forward to seeing the finished document. Thank you. No other questions for Speaker Summers? They're all shaking their heads no. Thank you. Anybody else? Public comment, please come forward. Just come up and fill up the chairs. They're all empty now. I'll take this time to recognize Representative Pendercraft for being here. Nice to see you. And of course, Representative Shelley Hamill. Duncan. So close. Foreman. Oh, former.
Once a rep, always a rep.
Always a rep. Please go ahead. Tricia, if you'd like to start.
Hello. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and all of you. Today, my name is Tricia Wynot, and I'm the Executive Director of Stride Learning Center. We are one of the 14 regional developmental preschools in our state. I'm the Director of Region 12, which happens to cover all of Laramie County. We incorporated in 1973, so we are celebrating our 50th anniversary serving babies, infants, toddlers, preschoolers, and their families who have special needs. It's been a privilege of mine. I've been at Stride since '92, so for 30 years I have been at Stride. And we need a big change, an important change. No longer does our state CDC system work well for all of our children and families. We just don't. We are education. We belong in the Department of Education. I didn't always agree with my colleagues, other CDC directors around the state, because I have been pushing for this for years. We are education. We are. And special needs children cannot have special needs services without first general ed. Special needs children that we serve, children with autism, Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, neurofibromatosis, developmental delays, speech articulation delays, CP, all need to first start with gen ed. So we have two problems. We are funded for special ed, early childhood special ed, at a lesser rate, 50 cents to the dollar of what school district kiddos are funded. And secondly, we're minus the general education fund. So we have that hurdle, we have a financial hurdle, and we need the governance and leadership of Department of Ed. Stride, unfortunately, at this stage in our history, we have 4 years left, and then we will have to close our doors if we don't have a funding structure systemic change in Wyoming. And I think that's going to come from a leadership change. Our good folks at Department of Health, all the people here in this room that have vested interest, all care about children. We can agree on that. What isn't working is this current system that we have. Stride has been drawing down from our reserves at an alarming rate for over 10 years. We do receive donations and fundraising efforts, not as rich as some of our other county counterparts and not as lucrative as some of our other CDC fundraising efforts. So it's not for a lack of not trying. And our community in Cheyenne and Burns, Pine Bluffs, Albin, they're all behind Stride Learning Center. Like I said, we've been around for so long, over 10,000 families served. But the funding is an issue. And first, we need to be in the Department of Ed, maybe in an early childhood office. That sounds great. I love this new superintendent and her willingness to roll up her sleeves and dig into this because it needs to be done. But we can't wait 30 more years. Stride won't be able to wait more than 4. Thank you.
Questions for Tricia? Thank you, Tricia. Representatives, one of you pick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I got picked. Pat Sweeney from Casper, here representing myself. And I was part of the effort in 2020 to try to get a better transition plan and try to figure some of this out. I appreciated Senator Scott's comments, and I appreciated Representative Brown's comments very much so. I think we're at a kind of a pivotal moment in time with new leadership at the Department of Education. And to keep, if we don't move forward, keep working on it, at least, it's going to be tough during a budget session to get anything through. But is the legislature ready and prepared to basically put together a long-term funding model that's going to work? By that, I mean equal to our school districts, as was previously stated. And I think that's the long-term commitment that we've really got to reach down and figure out. Because with all of the negativity out there currently against our school districts and our school boards and our superintendents, can we reach some sort of fundamental agreement in the legislature on funding at a fair rate long-term? So those are my comments. I'll keep it short and just appreciate the time to discuss this. And great conversation this morning and great questions. Thank you.
Does anybody have questions for Representative Sweeney? Thank you. Shelley, it's all yours.
Thank you, Shelley Duncan, and I am representing an entity called Wonder School. Going back to the child care portion, I have submitted a request to our chairman for a presentation at a future meeting, but I just wanted to answer a few questions that you guys brought up. And a child care desert is defined as a subdivision or a county with at least 50 children under the age of 5 that has no licensed child care provider or more than 3 times as many children as licensed daycare slots. In Wyoming, we have a supply of 22,699 and the demand is 28,092. So there is a gap of 5,393. So the company that I represent, they will be hopefully be able to do a presentation for you that has been working really well in other states nearby. One of the most recent trips I did was to Nevada over in Reno, and they're very similar in the types of population and rural and such as we are. And they're having great success partnering with their legislature as an economic development idea with this. And they're bringing in, creating new providers. Mainly they focus on home-based providers, but they also help centers as well. So it's bringing in their first year with Nevada, they brought in $30 million. And they're giving education plus business help with these home providers. So there's a lot of great things with that. So when we talk about the early childhood, you know, the daycares and that development, there's a real great need here in our state with, especially in our rural areas that don't have, and we may have some that are, but no one knows about them. So we need to, as our governor's task force talked about, there's a lot of things that we're not connecting. People don't know. There's a lot of inefficiencies. So I just wanted to point that out. And then one last thing was that, real quick, was that the direct result of childcare issues, the national economy loses upwards of $57 billion annually from the loss of earnings, productivity, and revenue. We can't get families back into work if we don't have childcare. And it's been proven that, as we've seen over and over, that 0 to 3 and then that, you know, coming into kindergarten, if you've got good quality care, the parents are more productive, the student has a better foundation, and it helps a lot further along in their education in life. So I just wanted to point out a couple things that I heard, and hopefully we can dive deeper and have a win-win for everyone.
Anybody got questions for Shelley? Thank you for presenting. Okay, so when we come back after lunch, we'll work on the last part of this, which is committee directives. And Then we'll go into kindergarten readiness, so we're getting way behind. An hour is what we'll have for lunch. It's essentially 12:30 now. We'll be back here at 1:30 going. Thank you.
Close.
Not anymore.